Perhaps you have, somewhere in your kitchen, a small jar or grinder filled with black peppercorns. If you were to open it now to pour a few of those dark wrinkled seeds into your palm, you would feel their weight, surprisingly substantial for something so small. Each one no larger than a few grains of rice, hard and dense, carrying within it a sharpness that has travelled further than you might imagine. These little spheres, so commonplace now that we scatter them without thought across our food, once commanded prices that exceeded gold by weight. They financed voyages across oceans, built trading empires, and shaped the economic systems through which we still organize our commercial lives. Tonight, we'll explore the gentle history of the spice trade, that long network of desire and distance that connected pepper farms in India to medieval kitchens in London, that brought nutmeg from remote Indonesian islands to Venetian warehouses, that made cinnamon worth fighting wars over and cloves worth more than silver. There's no need to remember prices or dates, no need to concentrate on the names of merchants or the routes of ships. Let the story wash over you like the scent of cardamom opening in warm oil. Settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow your mind to drift as we explore the sleepy history of when pepper was worth more than gold. Before there were stock markets or joint ventures, before anyone imagined commerce spanning continents through permanent institutions, there was simply desire. The desire for flavour, for preservation, for medicine, for the small luxuries that made life more bearable in a world without refrigeration or antibiotics or easy abundance. And there were the objects of that desire, growing in particular places, known to some people and unknown to others, creating the conditions for trade across distances so vast that the journey itself became part of the value. Picture the Malabar coast of India, sometime around 3,000 years before the Common Era. The climate here is particular, the monsoon rains reliable, the soil volcanic and rich. Pepper vines grow, climbing up, supporting trees, their fruits ripening from green to red before being harvested and dried in the tropical sun. The drying transforms them, the outer layer wrinkling and darkening, the interior remaining pale and hard. The process takes days, the berries spread on mats or bare ground, turned occasionally, the heat drawing out moisture and concentrating the compound that gives pepper its characteristic bite. The people who cultivated these vines understood their value locally, used pepper in their own cooking, in their own medicines, traded it among neighbouring communities. But the value was modest, constrained by local supply and local demand, the economics of a product that could be grown in reasonable abundance in the regions where it grew at all. What would transform this local crop into something precious beyond its inherent qualities was distance. The simple fact that pepper grew only in certain places and was desired in many others, separated by thousands of miles of difficult terrain and dangerous water. The ancient Egyptians used spices in their burial practices, wrapping bodies destined for eternity in linens infused with resins and aromatics imported from distant lands. The tomb of Rameses II, who died in 1213 before the Common Era, contained peppercorns placed in his nostrils, expensive imports from India carried across deserts and seas to rest with a pharaoh in his eternal chamber. The presence of those peppercorns in an Egyptian tomb tells us that trade routes already existed, that some mechanism had developed to move goods from the Malabar coast across the vast distance to the Nile Valley, that someone was organizing caravans or ships, accepting the costs and risks of transport in exchange for the profits that could be made from selling rare goods in distant markets. The Mesopotamians, dwelling between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, imported spices for their temples and palaces. Cuneiform tablets from Babylon record purchases of cinnamon and cassia, neither of which grew anywhere near Mesopotamia. The tablets note quantities and prices, careful accounting in the wedge-shaped script pressed into soft clay and then baked hard, preserving for millennia the record of transactions that seemed important enough to document. A merchant in Babylon purchasing cinnamon for a temple offering was participating in a trade network that stretched to Ceylon, or perhaps even to southern China, though he likely had no clear idea where the cinnamon actually originated, buying instead from intermediaries who bought from other intermediaries, each one adding cost. The Romans transformed the ancient spice trade from a trickle into a flood. The Roman Empire at its height commanded resources on a scale that earlier civilizations could not match, and Roman wealth created Roman appetites. Pepper became common enough in wealthy Roman households that it appeared in cookbooks, in recipes for sauces and seasonings, as an assumed ingredient rather than an exotic luxury. The cookbook attributed to Apicius, compiled sometime in the first few centuries of the Common Era, mentions pepper in hundreds of recipes, grinding it into pastes with honey and wine, mixing it with fish sauce and herbs, treating it as a staple rather than a rarity. But this Roman demand had economic consequences that troubled some observers. Pliny the Elder, the Roman author and natural philosopher who died in 79 when Vesuvius erupted, wrote with concern about the spice trade in his Natural History. He calculated that the Roman Empire was spending approximately 50 million sesterces annually on imports from India, Arabia, and China. This was an enormous sum, representing a significant drain on Roman precious metal reserves. The trade was almost entirely one-sided. Romans wanted spices, silk, gems, and other Eastern luxuries. The East wanted Roman gold and silver, having little interest in the wine, olive oil, and manufactured goods the Romans offered in exchange. A single pound of pepper in Rome during the first century of the Common Era might cost 4 denarii. To understand what this meant, consider that a skilled labourer in Rome earned perhaps 3 to 4 denarii for a full day's work. A pound of pepper represented a day's wages for a carpenter or mason, a substantial expense, yet not so expensive as to be entirely out of reach for Rome's comfortable classes. The price was high enough to make pepper valuable, to make it worth the long journey from India to Rome, but not so high as to limit the market to only the wealthier citizens. The Romans received their spices through multiple routes, each one a network of intermediaries and transport modes. The primary maritime route ran from Indian ports on the Malabar coast, across the Arabian Sea to ports in what is now Yemen or Oman, then overland to the Red Sea, where goods were loaded onto different ships for transport to Egyptian ports, then overland again to Alexandria, then loaded once more onto Mediterranean vessels for the journey to Rome. At each transfer point, at each change of transport mode, costs accumulated. Merchants charged for their services, ship captains required payment, port authorities collected duties, everyone who touched the cargo added their portion. An alternative route ran overland, or mostly overland, following paths that would later be called the Silk Road, though that name wouldn't be coined until the 19th century. Spices could travel from India northwest into Persia, then westward through Mesopotamia and the Levant, eventually reaching Mediterranean ports where Roman merchants could purchase them. This route was longer in distance but avoided some of the maritime risks. though it added other dangers from bandits and the political complications of moving goods through territories controlled by peoples not always friendly to Rome. The discovery of the monsoon wind patterns made the maritime route more efficient. Sometime in the 1st century before the Common Era, perhaps earlier, Greek or Arab sailors working in the service of Rome learned what Indian Ocean mariners had known for centuries, that the winds in the Indian Ocean blow reliably in one direction for part of the year and then reverse, blowing just as reliably in the opposite direction for the rest of the year. A ship leaving Egypt in summer could catch the southwest monsoon to sail directly to India, reaching the Malabar coast in a few months of steady sailing. The ship could remain in port through the winter, loading cargo, waiting for the seasons to turn, then catch the northeast monsoon in winter to sail back to Egypt, completing a round trip in roughly a year. This direct sailing reduced the number of intermediaries. Instead of cargo passing through multiple hands, each adding cost, a Roman merchant or his agent could sail to India, purchase directly from Indian suppliers, and return with a cargo that had passed through fewer markup stages. The reduction in intermediaries didn't eliminate the premium. Pepper was still expensive in Rome, but it reduced the multiple that price represented over origin costs. Where pepper might have cost 50 or 100 times its origin price, when passing through many intermediaries, direct sailing might reduce that multiple to 30 or 40 times, still an enormous markup but a meaningful reduction that made the trade more profitable for those who could organize direct voyages. The port of Muziris, on the Malabar coast in what is now the Indian state of Kerala, became one of the primary destinations for Roman ships. Archaeological evidence suggests a substantial Roman commercial presence here. Coins bearing the faces of Roman emperors found in excavations, fragments of amphorae that once held Roman wine, the remains of warehouses where goods from the interior of India were gathered for export. Indian merchants brought pepper from the farms where it grew, transported on ox carts or boats on Kerala's rivers and backwaters, gathered it in Muziris where it could be inspected, weighed and sold to the Roman traders who had sailed so far to purchase it. The actual weighing and sale involved careful negotiation. Pepper was sorted by quality. The best berries commanding higher prices, the smaller or damaged ones sold for less. Weights and measures had to be agreed upon, the Roman merchant and Indian supplier comparing scales, adjusting for differences in their systems of measurement, recording the transaction in terms both could understand. Payment was usually in Roman gold or silver coins, which Indian merchants accepted readily, the precious metal having value regardless of whose face appeared on the coins. These Roman coins would circulate in Indian markets, used for local transactions, or be melted down for their metal content, the gold and silver flowing eastward to balance the spices flowing west. The economics of a single Roman spice voyage illustrate the potential profits and the substantial risks. A merchant might invest perhaps 10,000 denarii in outfitting a ship, purchasing trade goods or silver to use for purchases in India, hiring a captain and crew, provisioning the vessel for a year-long voyage. If the voyage succeeded, if the ship reached India, purchased a full cargo of pepper and other spices, returned safely to Egypt and then to Rome, the cargo might sell for 40 or 50,000 denarii, a 4 or 5-fold return on investment. The profit was extraordinary, justifying the risk of shipwreck, disease, piracy, or political disruptions that might end with the loss of ship, cargo, and crew. But many voyages did not succeed. Ships were lost to storms, particularly the dangerous waters around the southern tip of India or in the passages between islands of the Indonesian archipelago. Crews died of diseases for which the ancient world had no effective treatments, their bodies committed to the ocean, the ship limping home undermanned if it returned at all. Pirates operated in the narrow seas where shipping routes concentrated, attacking vessels they believed carried valuable cargoes. Wars between Rome and Persia, or between Rome and various Arabian kingdoms, could close trade routes temporarily, leaving merchants with capital tied up in goods they couldn't move or ships they couldn't safely send to sea. The pepper that successfully reached Rome was stored in warehouses, sorted and eventually distributed to the shops and market stalls where ordinary Romans made their purchases. The city of Rome had a quarter called the Horia Piperataria, the pepper warehouses, a district devoted to storing the single spice, suggesting the volumes involved in supplying the capital's appetite. The warehouses were substantial structures, built to protect valuable goods from theft, fire and vermin, employing guards and warehousemen, representing considerable investment in infrastructure for this one commodity. In Roman kitchens, the pepper was ground using mortars and pestles, the hard berries requiring effort to reduce to powder. The grinding released the aromatic oils, filling the kitchen with scent, the pungency making eyes water if one bent too close. The ground pepper was added to dishes during cooking or sprinkled over food at table, each meal involving a small consumption of something that had travelled perhaps 5,000 miles, passed through a dozen or more hands, survived months at sea, and cost a day's wages per pound. The Romans also used pepper medicinally, or believed they did, which sustained demand even among those who might not have particularly enjoyed its flavour. Roman physicians prescribed pepper for various ailments, believing it had warming properties that could counteract cold humours, that it could aid digestion, stimulate appetite, and treat respiratory complaints. These beliefs, while medically incorrect by modern standards, were sincere and widespread, and they meant that pepper served functions beyond simple flavouring, making it a necessity rather than merely a luxury in the minds of many Romans. The trade relationship between Rome and India was one of the earliest examples of sustained large-scale commerce between civilizations separated by such vast distances. The pattern it established, of high-value goods moving from east to west and precious metals moving from west to east, would persist for more than a millennium, shaping the economic relationship between Europe and Asia through the medieval period and into the early modern era. The trade enriched Indian merchants and kingdoms, providing them with Roman gold that could be used to mint coins, finance construction projects, and enhance the treasuries of Indian rulers. It satisfied Roman appetites while concerning Roman moralists and economists who worried about the drain of wealth eastward. As the Roman Empire weakened in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, the spice trade didn't cease, but it did contract. The purchasing power that had sustained such large volumes of imports diminished as Roman political unity fragmented and economic productivity declined. The infrastructure that had facilitated trade, the Roman roads, the naval patrols that suppressed piracy, the political stability that allowed merchants to plan long-term investments, all of this deteriorated. The trade routes themselves remained. The knowledge of how to sail to India or traverse the desert caravan paths didn't disappear, but the volumes decreased as European demand shrank, and the economic organisation necessary to sustain the trade became more difficult. Picture a warehouse in Alexandria in 450 as the Western Roman Empire approached its final dissolution. The building stands less full than it once did, the stacks of pepper sacks lower, the varieties of spices less diverse. A merchant walks between the diminished inventory, calculating whether to organize another voyage to India, whether the likely prices in Rome or Constantinople will justify the considerable expense and risk. His grandfather had made a fortune in the spice trade during better times. He himself has done adequately but not spectacularly. His sons, he suspects, may need to find other occupations, the opportunities in spices diminishing as the markets contract, and the political situation makes commerce increasingly difficult. Yet even as the Roman trade declined, other networks persisted and grew. Arab merchants, Persian traders, Indian ocean mariners all continued the commerce that had existed before Rome's rise and would continue after its fall. The spices still grew in the same places, ripening and being harvested and dried according to agricultural rhythms that paid no attention to the political fortunes of distant empires. The desire for spices remained in the places they didn't grow, creating the fundamental economic condition, differential between supply price and demand price, that would sustain the trade through all the political and economic transformations that the following centuries would bring. The knowledge of the monsoon winds remained, passed from captain to captain, from navigator to navigator, recorded in sailing manuals and mental maps that guided ships across the Indian Ocean's vast expanse. The ports remained, some growing more important as others declined, the physical infrastructure of jetties and warehouses adapting to changing trade patterns. The merchants remained, adjusting their routes and methods, finding new markets as old ones contracted, patient and flexible in the way that successful traders must be, waiting for conditions to improve while finding ways to profit in the meantime. And the pepper continued to grow, the vines climbing their support trees, the berries ripening and being picked, the harvest dried in the sun that had dried pepper for thousands of years and would dry it for thousands more. The cultivators received their payments, modest local prices that represented only the first addition in the long chain of value that would accumulate as the pepper moved toward distant consumers. The system functioned, at smaller scale perhaps than during Rome's peak, but functioning still. The patient logic of trade connecting desire and supply across whatever distances separated them, regardless of empires rising or falling, attentive only to the eternal calculus of costs and prices and the profit that could be made by accepting the risks of moving goods from where they were cheap to where they were valuable. The fall of Rome did not end the spice trade, but it transformed the networks through which spices moved and the hands through which they passed. As Roman political unity dissolved in the West, other powers filled the spaces Rome had occupied, establishing new patterns of commerce that would persist for 1,000 years. The Mediterranean, which had been a Roman lake, became a contested space where multiple civilizations met, traded, and sometimes fought. And in this new configuration of power and commerce, certain cities and certain peoples would position themselves as essential intermediaries, controlling the flow of spices from east to west and extracting profit from every pound of pepper that made the journey. The Arab expansion that followed the rise of Islam in the 7th century created new commercial networks across vast territories. Arab merchants, operating from bases in Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, and numerous port cities, established trading relationships that stretched from Spain to Indonesia. from East Africa to Central Asia. These merchants inherited knowledge from earlier traders, the sailing routes across the Indian Ocean, the caravan paths through Arabian and Persian deserts, the locations of markets and the preferences of buyers. They added their own innovations, developing sophisticated credit instruments, forming partnerships that could span years and continents, creating a commercial culture that would dominate the medieval spice trade. The overland routes through the Middle East became the primary paths by which spices reached Europe during the early medieval period. Pepper and other spices arrived in Indian Ocean ports, sold by Indian merchants to Arab or Persian buyers, then loaded onto camels for the long journey across deserts and mountains to the Mediterranean coast. The caravans were substantial, sometimes hundreds of camels moving together for mutual protection and shared costs, their loads carefully balanced and protected from the weather, their handlers experienced in the rhythms of desert travel. The journey from an Indian port to Damascus or Cairo might take 6 months, a slow progress measured in the patient steps of camels, each day covering perhaps 20 or 30 miles, the caravan stopping at oases and caravanserais where water and provisions could be obtained. At each major city along the route the cargo might change hands. A merchant in Hormuz, the port at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, might purchase pepper from an Indian ship captain, then sell it to a merchant heading northwest toward Baghdad. The Baghdad merchant might hold the pepper in his warehouses for weeks or months, waiting for favourable market conditions, then sell to another merchant organising a caravan westward toward Damascus or Aleppo. At Damascus, yet another merchant might purchase the pepper, transport it to a Mediterranean port, and sell it to a Venetian or Genoese ship captain who would carry it to Europe. Each transaction involved negotiation, weighing, quality assessment, payment arrangements, and each one added cost. The markup at each stage reflected not just the merchant's desired profit, but the real costs and risks of the transaction. The merchant had capital tied up in inventory, warehouses to maintain, employees to pay, losses from spoilage or theft to absorb, and the ever-present risk that prices might fall before he could sell his goods. The markup had to compensate for all of this while still leaving enough profit to justify the effort and risk. A merchant buying pepper for 10 units and selling for 15 was not simply pocketing 5 units of pure profit. He was covering his costs and taking compensation for his time and risk, the 5-unit difference representing the value he added by moving the pepper from one location to another and holding it until it could be sold. Venice, perched at the northwestern end of the Adriatic Sea, emerged as the dominant European centre for the spice trade by the 12th century. Venice's position was partly geographic, accessible by sea from the eastern Mediterranean, but also connected to northern Europe through alpine passes and river routes. But geography alone doesn't explain Venice's success. The city developed institutions and practices that made it especially effective at organising long-distance trade. The Venetian government operated a fleet of armed merchant galleys, large rowing vessels that could fight if necessary, but primarily carried cargo, sailing on regular schedules to Alexandria, Constantinople, and other eastern ports. These state-operated galleys provided reliable transport that individual merchants could use without having to own and maintain ships themselves. The Venetian system for financing these voyages was sophisticated. The government would auction the right to command each galley, merchants bidding for the privilege, the winning bidder responsible for fitting out the vessel and managing the cargo. The system distributed risk, allowed merchants without enormous capital to participate, and ensured that the most capable operators commanded the galleys. The regular schedule meant that merchants could plan their purchases and sales, knowing when ships would depart and approximately when they would return. This predictability reduced uncertainty, one of the invisible costs that had historically made long-distance trade difficult to organize. In Alexandria, Venetian merchants maintained permanent establishments, warehouses and offices where they could store goods, negotiate with local suppliers and manage the complex logistics of international trade. Alexandria was the key transfer point where spices arriving from the Red Sea, having crossed from Indian Ocean ports, could be purchased by European merchants. The Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled Egypt from the mid-13th century, allowed this trade because the duties and taxes they collected provided crucial revenue. The arrangement benefited all parties. The Mamluks collected customs duties, the Arab merchants who brought spices from India and sold them in Alexandria earned their profits, and the Venetian merchants obtained the goods they needed to supply European markets. A typical transaction might proceed as follows. A Venetian merchant arriving in Alexandria aboard one of the regular galleys would visit the warehouses where spices were stored. He would examine samples, assessing quality by appearance, feel, and scent. Pepperberries should be hard, dry, and pungent. Discoloured or soft berries indicated age or poor storage. Adulteration was always a possibility, the spices mixed with cheaper substances to increase weight and profit. An experienced merchant could often detect such fraud through careful inspection, though some adulteration was subtle enough to escape notice until the goods reached Europe and were examined by the merchants who would make retail purchases. Once satisfied with the quality, the merchant would negotiate price. This negotiation was complex, involving not just the base price per unit weight, but also questions of payment terms, delivery arrangements, and allocation of various costs and duties. Would payment be in gold, silver, or some other medium? Would it be immediate or deferred? Who would bear the cost of transport to the harbour? Who would pay the various customs duties and fees that Mamluk officials required? Each of these details mattered, affecting the true cost of the transaction, and experienced merchants understood that the negotiation was not simply about the stated price, but about the entire structure of the deal. Payment often involved bills of exchange, a financial instrument that the medieval Italian merchants had developed to manage the complexities of international trade. A Venetian merchant in Alexandria might not carry large quantities of gold or silver, too risky given the dangers of theft. Instead, he might present a letter of credit drawn on a Venetian bank or on correspondence in Venice, promising to pay the seller a specified sum at a future date. The seller, if he trusted the creditworthiness of the Venetian merchant and his backers, would accept this promise as payment, knowing that he could collect the sum in Venice or sell the letter to someone else who had use for funds in Venice. This system allowed trade to occur without the physical movement of large quantities of precious metals, reducing risk and cost while facilitating larger volumes of commerce. The journey from Alexandria to Venice took weeks, the galley following the Mediterranean coast, stopping at various ports for provisions or to conduct additional trading. The spices were stored in the galley's hold, protected from seawater, though the risk of spoilage or damage was never entirely eliminated. Storms could swamp a galley, pirates operated in narrow passages where ships had to slow, political conflicts could make certain routes temporarily dangerous or impossible, Each voyage represented a concentration of capital and risk, the value of the cargo sometimes exceeding the value of the vessel carrying it, the safe arrival never guaranteed until the galley actually tied up at a Venetian dock and the goods were unloaded into warehouses. In Venice, the spices would be stored in warehouses until they could be sold. Some were sold locally to Venetian households or to merchants from other Italian cities who came to Venice to purchase. But much of the cargo was destined for Transalpine Europe, for markets in Germany, France, the Low Countries, and England. Merchants from these regions maintained offices in Venice, purchasing spices and arranging for their transport northward. The Fondaco dei Tedeschi, the German trading house, was one of the most important of these foreign establishments. A large building where German merchants could live, store goods, and conduct business, subject to Venetian regulations that specified where they could operate and with whom they could trade. The transport from Venice to northern Europe added further costs. Goods might travel by pack train through Alpine passes, a journey requiring weeks and involving substantial expense for the animals, handlers, and tolls charged by the various authorities who controlled mountain routes. Alternatively, goods could be shipped by river barge up the Po, then overland to the Rhine or Danube systems, then by barge again toward markets in the German lands or the Low Countries. Each mode of transport had its costs and risks, delays and difficulties, all of which accumulated into the final price that a consumer in London or Paris would pay for pepper that had originated in India perhaps 2 years earlier. By the time pepper reached a retail market in Northern Europe, its price had multiplied many times over from its origin cost. A pound of pepper that an Indian cultivator might have sold for a few small coins, perhaps the equivalent of a penny in English money, might cost 2 shillings in London, a multiplication of approximately 24 times. To understand what 2 shillings meant to a medieval English worker, consider that a skilled craftsman might earn 4 to 6 pence per day, meaning a pound of pepper cost 4 to 6 days of wages. For a labourer earning less, perhaps 3 pence daily, a pound of pepper represented 8 days of work. This was not a casual purchase, but a significant expenditure, marking special occasions or demonstrating a household's prosperity. Yet despite these high prices, demand remained strong. The wealthy used spices liberally, incorporating them into elaborate dishes that demonstrated their access to rare and expensive ingredients. Cookbooks from the medieval period, written for wealthy households, call for spices in quantities that seem extravagant by modern standards. A single recipe might require half a pound of pepper, several ounces of ginger, generous amounts of cinnamon and cloves, the cost of the spices sometimes exceeding the cost of the meat or fish they seasoned. This use of spices was partly about flavour, but also about display, about demonstrating through conspicuous consumption that one commanded resources sufficient to purchase goods that had travelled halfway around the world. The middling classes stretched to afford smaller quantities, using spices more sparingly, but still viewing them as desirable, as markers of respectability and comfort. A merchant's household in Florence or Bruges might purchase spices in smaller amounts, grinding small quantities as needed, making a pound of pepper last for months rather than using it lavishly. The careful preservation of these expensive ingredients, storing them in sealed containers, grinding only what was needed immediately, reflected an economic calculation about value and use, each pinch of pepper representing a small but meaningful cost. The poor generally did without or substituted local herbs and seasonings that provided some pungency without the expense of imported spices. Mustard, grown locally in much of Europe, could provide heat. Native herbs like sage and thyme added flavour. These substitutes were imperfect. They didn't taste like pepper or ginger, but they were affordable, and most medieval Europeans had never tasted true pepper, and thus didn't know precisely what they were missing. The spice trade served the upper portions of society, the wealthy and comfortable, while the majority of the population lived and died without ever tasting the black pepper that was so common in aristocratic kitchens. The economic effects of the spice trade extended beyond the immediate buyers and sellers. Venice became wealthy partly through its role as spice intermediary. The profits from the trade funding the construction of palaces and churches, supporting artists and craftsmen, allowing the city to maintain its independence and naval power. The Venetian arsenal, the massive shipyard that could construct a galley in a single day during peak efficiency, was funded partly by profits from Eastern trade. The architectural splendours that still draw visitors to Venice, the Doge's Palace, the Basilica of San Marco with its gold mosaics and marble columns, these were built with wealth generated partly by the patient commerce in pepper and cinnamon and cloves. The Arab merchants who controlled the middle stages of the trade also prospered. Cairo became one of the great commercial centres of the medieval world, its markets filled with goods from across the Islamic world and beyond, its merchant class wealthy and influential. Baghdad, Damascus, Aleppo, all of these cities benefited from their positions along the trade routes, collecting duties, hosting merchant communities, providing the services that trade required. The spice trade was only one part of this larger commercial network, but it was an important part, the high value of spices relative to their weight, making them especially profitable for long-distance commerce. The cultivators in India, by contrast, saw relatively little of the final value their crops generated. A pepper farmer in Kerala might sell his harvest for prices that seemed adequate by local standards, but represented only a tiny fraction of what the pepper would eventually command in Europe. The farmer had no knowledge of European prices, no way to understand the chain of markups that would follow his sale. He calculated his profits based on his costs of cultivation, the labour involved in tending the vines and harvesting and processing the berries, and the alternative uses he might make of his land and time. If growing pepper was more profitable than growing rice or other crops, he would continue growing pepper. The fact that his pepper would eventually sell for 20 or 30 times what he received was irrelevant to his economic decision, invisible to him, occurring in markets and places he would never see. This informational asymmetry was one of the foundations of the medieval spice trade's profitability. If Indian cultivators had known European prices, they might have demanded more for their pepper. If European consumers had known Indian prices, they might have questioned why they were paying such enormous multiples. But the distance and the multiple intermediary stages kept this information fragmented. Each participant in the chain knew his own costs and the prices he could obtain, but no one had visibility across the entire system. The Venetian merchant didn't know and couldn't easily discover what the pepper had cost in India. The Indian cultivator didn't know and couldn't easily discover what the pepper would fetch in London. This opacity allowed each intermediary to maintain his markup without pressure to reduce it. The system was stable because it benefited everyone involved, or at least everyone with the power to disrupt it. The Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt collected customs revenues that were crucial to their treasury. The Venetian government collected duties on the spices passing through Venice. The various merchants along the chain, Arab, Persian, Venetian, German, each earned profits that justified their efforts. The European consumers, while paying high prices, received goods they couldn't obtain elsewhere and valued, enough to pay those prices. The only participants without power to change the system were the cultivators at the beginning of the chain, and the poorest consumers at the end, neither of whom had alternatives or leverage. The stability of the system also depended on Venice's effective monopoly over European access to spices. Other Italian cities, particularly Genoa, competed with Venice for Eastern trade. But Venice's superior organization and political connections gave it dominant position. European attempts to bypass Venice by establishing direct contact with spice sources faced enormous obstacles. The distances were vast, the routes controlled by powers that had little reason to facilitate European access, the capital requirements for mounting expeditions beyond what most merchants could assemble. It was easier and more reliable to purchase spices in Venice, paying the Venetian markup, than to attempt the difficult and risky business of organizing direct trade with the East. Picture a merchant's house in London in 1300, the counting room where business was conducted. Ledger books record transactions in careful script, income from wool sales, expenses for household maintenance, investments in various trading ventures. Among the expenses is an entry for spices purchased in Venice through a correspondent there, a substantial sum representing months of profits from the wool business. The merchant had calculated carefully before making this purchase, weighing the cost against the prestige of serving well-spiced dishes at his daughter's wedding feast, the social benefits of conspicuous consumption that might facilitate future business relationships with other merchant families. These spices would arrive months after the order was placed, carried from Venice by a series of intermediaries, each one taking his portion. By the time they reached London, the spices represented not just the physical goods, but the accumulated effort of dozens or hundreds of people across 2 continents and most of a year. The merchant would store them carefully, locked in a chest in a dry room, too valuable to risk theft or spoilage. When the wedding feast occurred, when the cooks ground the pepper and mixed it with other spices into the elaborate sauces that medieval cooking required, when guests tasted the results and complimented the merchant on his hospitality and generosity, the pepper would be fulfilling its social function, marking status and celebrating an important family event, its cost justified by the meanings it conveyed. The Venetian system would persist for centuries, adapting to various disruptions but maintaining its essential structure. When the Mongol conquests of the 13th century briefly made overland routes across Central Asia more feasible, some spices travelled those paths, but the maritime route through Egypt remained primary. When the Black Death in the 14th century disrupted trade temporarily, killing merchants and sailors and reducing demand as populations declined, the system contracted but didn't collapse. When conflicts between Venice and Genoa or between Christian Europe and the Islamic world occasionally closed routes or made trade more difficult, merchants found ways to continue commerce, or waited patiently for conditions to improve. The persistence of the system reflected its fundamental economic logic. As long as spices grew in specific distant places and were desired in Europe, as long as the transport costs and risks remained high, as long as no one could bypass the established intermediaries, the structure would remain profitable for those who controlled it. The high prices that troubled Pliny in Roman times troubled medieval critics as well, moralists who questioned whether spending so much on luxuries was proper when so many people lived in poverty. But moral objections didn't change economic incentives, and the trade continued, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. The spices kept flowing westward, the gold and silver kept flowing eastward, the merchants kept calculating and negotiating and waiting, the cultivators kept growing and harvesting and selling. The consumers kept purchasing and using and desiring. The system had a life of its own, larger than any individual participant, persistent across generations, stable enough that merchants could base their careers on it, knowing that the patterns they learned in their youth would remain relevant throughout their working lives. The medieval spice trade was not dramatic, not revolutionary, just patient and profitable and enduring, a system that worked well enough for those who controlled it, that they had every reason to preserve it, and no reason to seek alternatives that might disrupt their comfortable positions. The system that had enriched Venice and the Arab merchants, that had persisted for centuries with only minor modifications, rested on a foundation that could be undermined. The foundation was geographic necessity, the simple fact that Europeans who wanted spices had to purchase them from intermediaries who controlled access to the sources. If that necessity could be eliminated, if Europeans could reach the spice-producing regions directly, the entire structure of intermediary profits would collapse. For much of the medieval period, such direct access seemed impossible. The distances too vast, the routes too difficult, the knowledge too fragmented. But in the 15th century, conditions began to change in ways that would transform the spice trade fundamentally. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 is sometimes cited as the catalyst that drove European exploration. The story suggesting that Ottoman control of eastern trade routes forced Europeans to seek alternatives. The reality was more complex and less dramatic. The Ottoman Empire didn't close the spice trade, they had their own economic interests in maintaining it and collecting the substantial customs revenues it generated. Trade through Ottoman territories continued after 1453 much as it had before. But the conquest did create anxiety in Europe about the security of existing routes and the possibility of future disruptions. This anxiety, combined with other factors, helped motivate the search for alternatives that Portuguese mariners had already begun pursuing for their own reasons. Portugal's exploration down the African coast was a gradual process, not a sudden burst of activity. Portuguese ships had been pushing southward along Africa's Atlantic coast since the early 1400s, each voyage extending slightly beyond the previous one, charting coastlines, making contact with African kingdoms, seeking gold and slaves and other trade opportunities. The motivation was partly scientific curiosity, partly religious mission, partly political ambition, but overwhelmingly economic. The Portuguese crown and the merchants who financed these expeditions sought profit, and the ultimate goal was to reach the source of the spices that Europeans purchased at such high prices in Venice and other Mediterranean markets. The progress was patient and methodical. A voyage might extend the known coastline by a few hundred miles, establish a trading post or fort, return with information about winds and currents and the peoples encountered. The next voyage would build on that knowledge, pushing slightly further, adding to the accumulated understanding of African geography. By the 1470s, Portuguese ships had reached the equator. By the 1480s, they had passed the southern tip of Africa, proving that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected, that a maritime route to India was theoretically possible. Bartolomeu Dias, commanding a Portuguese expedition, rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, the southern extremity of Africa, where the Atlantic Ocean meets the Indian Ocean. The achievement was significant but incomplete. Dias had proven the route was possible, but had not actually reached India. His ships, small caravels designed for exploration rather than long-distance trade, turned back before reaching the Malabar coast. The knowledge he brought back, charts of the African coast, information about winds and currents, observations of the distances involved, would be essential for the next expedition. But years would pass before Portugal were ready to attempt the full voyage to India and back. Vasco da Gama departed from Lisbon in July of 1497, commanding a fleet of 4 ships carrying approximately 170 men. The fleet was better prepared than earlier expeditions, carrying trade goods selected for appeal to Indian markets, gifts for Indian rulers whose cooperation would be necessary, weapons and soldiers sufficient to defend against attack. The voyage followed the route Dias had charted around Africa, then struck across the Indian Ocean toward the Malabar coast. The crossing was difficult, taking months, the ships far from land for extended periods, the crew suffering from scurvy and dysentery, the navigation dependent on instruments and dead reckoning in waters Portuguese sailors had never traversed. The fleet reached Calicut, on the Malabar coast, in May of 1498, nearly 10 months after leaving Lisbon. Calicut was a major spice trading centre, a cosmopolitan port where merchants from Arabia, Persia, India and Southeast Asia conducted business, where the local ruler, the Zamorin, maintained order and collected customs duties from the thriving commerce. Da Gama's arrival was unexpected. The appearance of European ships that had sailed directly from Portugal, rather than purchasing spices through the usual intermediaries. These Zamorin received da Gama with curiosity and some suspicion, uncertain what these Portuguese intended and whether their presence would disrupt the established trading patterns that generated revenue for his kingdom. The initial negotiations were difficult. Da Gama's trade goods, which the Portuguese had thought appropriate for African markets, were unimpressive to Indian merchants accustomed to dealing in high-value commodities. The gifts he brought for the Zamorin seemed inadequate, not befitting an emissary from a distant kingdom. The established Arab and Indian merchants viewed the Portuguese as potential competitors and worked to prevent them from obtaining favourable terms. But eventually, after weeks of negotiation and growing tension, da Gama managed to purchase a cargo of pepper and other spices, paying higher prices than he had hoped, but securing enough goods to make the voyage potentially profitable. The return journey was even more difficult than the outward voyage. The monsoon patterns meant leaving India in late summer or autumn to catch favourable winds back across the Indian Ocean. The crew, already depleted by disease, suffered further losses during the long crossing. Of the approximately 170 men who had left Lisbon, only 55 returned, the rest dying of disease or being left in Africa or India for various reasons. 2 of the 4 ships were lost. Da Gama himself didn't reach Lisbon until September of 1499. More than 2 years after departure, his fleet reduced to a single ship limping home with a decimated crew but carrying a valuable cargo of spices. The economics of the voyage were instructive. The expedition had cost the Portuguese crown approximately 300,000 aris, A substantial investment including the cost of building and outfitting the ships, purchasing trade goods, paying crews, and covering all the other expenses of a 2-year voyage. The spices that returned, when sold in Lisbon, generated revenue of approximately 3 million oris, a 10-fold return on investment. Even after accounting for the ships lost and the salaries owed to the families of dead crew members, the voyage was spectacularly profitable. More importantly, it demonstrated that direct trade with India was possible, that Portuguese ships could make the journey and return with cargoes that would command high prices in European markets. The Portuguese crown moved quickly to exploit this opportunity. Additional fleets were organised and dispatched, each one larger and better equipped than da Gama's pioneering voyage. The Portuguese established fortified trading posts along the East African and Indian coasts, negotiating with local rulers when possible, using force when negotiation failed. The goal was to control key maritime choke points, to establish a network of forts and fleets that would allow Portugal to dominate the Indian Ocean spice trade in the same way that Venice and Arab merchants had dominated it previously. Alfonso de Albuquerque, serving as Portuguese governor of India in the early 1500s, implemented a strategy of strategic fort construction. He captured Hormuz in 1515, controlling the entrance to the Persian Gulf. He captured Goa in 1510, establishing it as the Portuguese headquarters in India. He captured Malacca in 1511, controlling the strait through which spices from the Indonesian islands had to pass to reach Indian Ocean markets. Each of these forts served both military and commercial purposes, projecting Portuguese power while also serving as trading posts where spices could be purchased, stored and loaded onto Portuguese ships for the journey to Europe. The establishment of these forts and the regular sailing of Portuguese fleets created a new route for spices to reach Europe, bypassing the traditional path through the Middle East and Venice. Portuguese ships, larger and better armed than the galleys Venice had used, could carry more cargo and defend themselves against pirates or rivals. The voyage was long and dangerous, taking 6 months to a year from Lisbon to India and back, but it eliminated the multiple intermediaries that had added cost at each stage of the medieval trade route. A Portuguese merchant could load pepper in Goa at prices not much above what Indian cultivators received, transport it directly to Lisbon, and sell it for prices that undercut Venetian competition while still earning substantial profits. The impact on prices was significant, but not as revolutionary as might be expected. Pepper prices in Lisbon in the early 1500s were approximately 1/5 of what they'd been in Venice during the medieval period. This reduction reflected the elimination of multiple markups, the Arab merchants, the Mamluk customs duties, the Venetian intermediaries, all of them bypassed by direct Portuguese trade. But the prices were still substantial, still many times higher than what the pepper cost in India, because the transportation costs and risks remained considerable. Ships were lost to storms, crews died of disease, capital was tied up for years at a time, and all of these costs had to be recovered through the prices charged for spices that successfully reached European markets. The Portuguese crown established a monopoly over the spice trade from India, declaring that all spices imported to Portugal must come on crown-owned ships or ships operating under crown licenses. This royal monopoly structure was similar to the Venetian system in some respects, concentrating control in a single entity that could coordinate the trade and extract maximum profit. But the crown monopoly was less efficient than private enterprise might have been. The bureaucracy involved in managing the trade, the corruption and inefficiency that plagued government-operated ventures, the political considerations that sometimes overrode economic logic, all of these factors prevented the Portuguese from realizing the full potential efficiency gains that direct trade might have offered. The journey itself became routinized over time, the annual fleets departing Lisbon in March or April to catch favourable winds, sailing southwest across the Atlantic to Brazil before turning east toward the Cape of Good Hope, using the prevailing wind patterns that Portuguese mariners had learned through years of experience. The ships would stop at various African ports for provisions and water, round the Cape, sail up the East African coast to Mozambique or other Portuguese stations, then cross to India. After loading spices and other cargo, the return journey would begin in December or January, catching the northeast monsoon for the crossing to Africa, then working north along the African coast and northwest across the Atlantic to Lisbon. The entire round trip took at least a year, often longer, and was dangerous throughout, but the route became known, the patterns predictable, the knowledge passed from captain to captain. The human cost of this trade was substantial. Sailors died in large numbers, from scurvy on the long ocean crossings, from malaria and other tropical diseases in African and Indian ports, from shipwrecks and violence and the simple accumulation of hardships that a year or more at sea imposed. The Crown had difficulty recruiting enough sailors willing to make these voyages despite offering wages that were good by Portuguese standards. The reputation of the India Run, the Carrera de India as it was called, was dark. Men who sailed on these ships understood they might not return, that the odds of surviving multiple voyages were poor. Some sailed out of desperation, having no better options. Others were convicts or other undesirables whom the Crown was happy to send on dangerous voyages. The romantic image of Portuguese exploration obscures this grim reality, the expendable lives that powered the commerce. The profits from the spice trade flowed primarily to the Portuguese crown and the favoured merchants who held licences to participate. The crown used these revenues to finance its other ambitions, military ventures in North Africa, construction, projects in Lisbon, the maintenance of the royal court. Some wealth trickled down to the merchants and craftsmen and sailors who participated in the trade, but the distribution was highly unequal. Portugal itself, a relatively small kingdom on the western edge of Europe, gained a windfall from its monopoly on direct access to Asian spices, but the wealth didn't transform Portuguese society fundamentally. Much of the profit was spent on consumption rather than invested in productive capacity, and when the monopoly eventually eroded, Portugal would find itself without sustainable foundations for continued prosperity. The impact on Venice and the traditional spice trade routes was initially severe but not catastrophic. Venice had built its wealth on multiple types of commerce, and spices, while important, were not the only basis of Venetian prosperity. The city adapted, its merchants finding other goods to trade, its bankers providing financial services, its institutions proving resilient in the face of this competitive challenge. The volume of spices passing through Venice declined significantly, but didn't disappear entirely. Some spices still came through traditional routes, and Venice remained important for distributing spices and other goods to markets in Central Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. The city's decline, when it came, was gradual rather than sudden, a slow diminishment of commercial dominance over decades rather than a collapse. The Portuguese monopoly also faced challenges that prevented it from being absolute. Other European powers, particularly Spain, England, and the Netherlands, began organising their own expeditions to Asia, seeking to break Portuguese control. The distances and difficulties that had protected the Portuguese advantage for several decades couldn't protect it indefinitely. Knowledge of the routes spread. Ships could be built by anyone with sufficient capital. Captains and pilots could be hired away from Portuguese service or could learn through their own explorations. The first mover advantage that Portugal had gained through its patient decades of exploration down the African coast began to erode as competitors entered the market. The Dutch, in particular, would become formidable competitors. Dutch merchants, operating through the various Voorkompagnieën that preceded the VOC, began sending ships to Asia in the late 1590s, just a century after da Gama's pioneering voyage. The Dutch ships reached Indonesia directly, purchasing spices from the islands where they grew rather than from Indian intermediaries. This further shortening of the supply chain, bypassing even the Indian ports that Portuguese had used, offered the potential for even lower costs and higher profits. The English East India Company, chartered in 1600, added another competitor. The Portuguese monopoly, which had seemed so complete in the early 1500s, was fragmenting by the early 1600s, multiple European powers competing for access to Asian spices. Picture a warehouse in Lisbon in 1530, filled with sacks of pepper stacked to the ceiling, the scent strong and pervasive. A crown official walks through, tallying the inventory, calculating how much can be released to market without depressing prices too far, how much should be held in reserve for future sales. The warehouse represents capital tied up in inventory, the pepper having value, but not generating return until it's sold. The official must balance the desire to realize that value quickly against the need to maintain prices at levels that maximize crown revenue. It's a calculation that Venetian merchants had made for centuries, and now Portuguese officials make it. The economic logic the same even as the actors and locations change. The Portuguese breakthrough had transformed the structure of the spice trade, eliminating multiple intermediary stages and shifting profits from Arab and Venetian merchants to the Portuguese crown and its licensees. But the fundamental economic conditions remained similar. Spices still grew in specific distant places, still required long and dangerous journeys to reach European markets, still commanded premium prices because of their rarity and the costs of transport. The identity of who profited had changed, but the basic relationship between supply and demand, between cost and price, between risk and return, remained recognizable. The Portuguese had found a more efficient route, but efficiency gains have limits, and the new system, while more profitable for those who controlled it, still operated according to the same patient logic of long-distance trade that had governed the spice business for thousands of years. The transformation would continue, new competitors entering, new routes being discovered, new efficiencies being realized. But the process was gradual, measured in decades and generations rather than in sudden revolutionary moments. The Portuguese had opened a new chapter in the spice trade, but the story was far from finished, and the system they had established would itself be challenged and eventually superseded by arrangements that the Portuguese of the early 1500s couldn't have anticipated. For now, though, in the early and middle 1500s, Portuguese ships sailed regularly between Lisbon and India, carrying spices westward and silver eastward, the crown collecting its monopoly profits, the sailors enduring their hardships, the European consumers paying lower prices than their grandparents had paid, but still regarding pepper as a valuable commodity rather than an everyday necessity. The slow transformation of the spice trade continuing its patient progress toward a future where pepper would cost less than gold, then less than silver, and eventually become so cheap that no one would remember a time when it had been worth more than precious metals by weight. The Portuguese had found their way to India, had established their forts and fleets, had created a system for bringing spices to Europe more efficiently than the medieval networks had managed. But India was not where the most valuable spices grew. Pepper came from India, and pepper was important, the foundation of the spice trade by volume and total value. But the spices that commanded the highest prices, that generated the most extravagant profits per pound, grew on tiny islands thousands of miles further east in the Indonesian archipelago. Nutmeg and mace came only from the Banda Islands, a small cluster of volcanic peaks rising from the ocean. Cloves grew only in the Moluccas, another remote island group. These geographic accidents of botany, these spices that would grow in such limited areas and nowhere else, created the possibility of monopoly more complete than anything achievable with pepper, which grew widely across the Malabar coast and could not easily be controlled. The Banda Islands, numbering perhaps 10 tiny dots of land scattered across a few miles of ocean, were the sole natural source of nutmeg in the world. The nutmeg tree, particular in its requirements, thrived in the volcanic soil and specific climate of these islands, but wouldn't grow well elsewhere, or at least wouldn't produce nutmeg of comparable quality. The trees took years to mature, 7 or 8 years from planting to first significant harvest, and the careful cultivation and harvesting of nutmeg was skilled work that the Bandanese people had perfected over generations. The outer flesh of the nutmeg fruit was removed and discarded, the inner nut extracted and dried, the lacy covering called mace separated and dried separately, both products valuable, the mace actually more valuable by weight than the nutmeg itself. The Moluccan Islands, particularly Ternate and Tidore and several smaller islands, were the exclusive source of cloves. The clove tree, even more particular than nutmeg, produced the aromatic flower buds that were harvested just before blooming, dried in the sun, until they turned dark brown and developed their characteristic shape and intense scent. The cultivation required knowledge passed down through generations, understanding when to harvest for optimal quality, how to dry the buds properly, how to maintain the trees through their productive years. The people of these islands had been exporting cloves for centuries before Europeans arrived, trading with Javanese and Malay merchants who carried the spices to Indian Ocean ports, where they entered the broader network that eventually brought them to Europe. The economics of these spice monopolies were extraordinary. A pound of nutmeg that a Bandanese cultivator might sell for a small sum, perhaps equivalent to a few pennies in European currency, might eventually sell in Europe for several pounds sterling, a markup of hundreds or even thousands of times the origin price. Even accounting for all the transport costs, the multiple intermediary markups, the losses to spoilage and shipwreck, the profits available to anyone who could control the supply of these spices were enormous. The Portuguese understood this, as did the Dutch and English who followed them to Asian waters. The question was how to establish control over islands that were small, remote, and inhabited by people who had their own interests and their own trading relationships that predated European arrival by centuries. The Dutch, arriving in the Indonesian islands in the late 1590s, were more aggressive than the Portuguese in pursuing monopoly control. Where the Portuguese had been content to establish trading posts and negotiate with local rulers for purchasing rights, the Dutch sought to control production directly, to eliminate competitors, and to restrict supply in ways that would maximize prices in European markets. The Veronique d'Oostindische Compagnie, the VOC, which we encountered in our previous journey through Amsterdam's counting houses, applied commercial logic ruthlessly in the Spice Islands, understanding that monopoly control would generate profits far exceeding what competitive trade could produce. Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, serving as Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies in the early 1600s, implemented a strategy of violent monopoly enforcement in the Banda Islands. The Bandanese people had been trading nutmeg with multiple buyers, Portuguese, English, Javanese, whoever offered reasonable prices. This competitive market kept prices relatively low and prevented any single buyer from controlling the trade. Cohen determined that this situation had to end, that the Dutch must be the sole purchaser of Banda nutmeg, able to set prices paid to cultivators and control the quantity released to European markets. When negotiation and economic pressure failed to achieve this monopoly, Cohen used military force. The VOC expedition to Banda in 1621 was a military operation disguised as a commercial venture. Dutch ships arrived with soldiers, not just traders. The population of the Banda Islands at that time was perhaps 15,000 people, spread across the small islands, living in villages that had existed for generations. What followed was a campaign of conquest and expulsion. The Bandanese who resisted were killed. Those who surrendered were transported to other islands as forced labourers, and the population was reduced to perhaps 1,000 people, mostly kept as slaves to continue nutmeg cultivation under Dutch supervision. Dutch colonists and imported labourers replaced the Bandanese population. The nutmeg groves divided into plantations operated under VOC control, the entire production of the islands now flowing through VOC channels and no others. The violence of this conquest was extreme even by the standards of the era. Thousands died in the fighting or from starvation and disease that followed the disruption of island society. The Bandanese culture, which had existed for centuries, was largely destroyed, the survivors scattered, their islands taken over by foreign occupiers. This violence served an economic purpose, establishing the monopoly control that would allow the VOC to maximize profits from nutmeg. But the human cost was borne entirely by people who had no voice in the decisions that destroyed their world and no share in the profits that their forced labour would generate. The VOC also implemented a policy of destroying nutmeg and clove trees that grew outside the islands they controlled. This supply destruction was economically rational from the VOC's perspective. Each tree producing spices outside VOC territory was a threat to the monopoly, potentially adding to supply and depressing prices. By sending expeditions to root out and burn these trees, the VOC could maintain artificial scarcity, keeping supply below the level that would exist in a competitive market, supporting prices at levels that generated extraordinary profits. The policy was enforced regularly, VOC ships sailing to various islands, searching for unauthorized spice trees, destroying any they found, punishing local populations who cultivated spices without VOC permission. The local populations bore the costs of this monopoly enforcement. Cultivators who might have grown nutmeg or cloves profitably were prohibited from doing so, the potential income from these crops denied to them. Islands that had historically exported small quantities of spices found their trees destroyed, their trading relationships severed, their economic options constrained. The VOC paid low prices to the cultivators on the islands they controlled, using their monopsony power as the sole buyer to suppress the prices paid to producers while maintaining high prices in European markets. The difference between what the VOC paid for nutmeg in Banda and what they charged for it in Amsterdam represented one of the most extreme examples of market power extracting value from producers with no alternatives. The English East India Company attempted to compete with the Dutch in the Spice Islands, but was largely outmanoeuvred. The English established a trading post on the island of Run in the Banda Group, negotiating with local leaders for the right to purchase nutmeg. But the VOC regarded this as an intolerable challenge to their monopoly and used force to expel the English. The Amboina massacre in 1623, where VOC officials executed English merchants on accusations of conspiracy, effectively ended English attempts to maintain a presence in the Moluccas. The English would shift their focus to India and other regions where Dutch power was less dominant, leaving the Spice Islands under VOC control for decades. The economics of monopoly supply destruction become clear when considering the price effects. In a competitive market, supply would expand to meet demand, prices falling as production increased. But the VOC deliberately kept supply restricted, destroying productive capacity that could have generated more spices. The result was that nutmeg and cloves remained expensive in Europe, far more expensive than they would have been if the market had been competitive. European consumers paid higher prices, the difference between competitive prices and monopoly prices representing a transfer of wealth from consumers to the VOC and its shareholders. The cultivators in the Spice Islands received low prices for their forced labour. The difference between what they received and what the spices were worth representing another transfer, this time from producers to the monopolist. Picture a nutmeg plantation on Banda in 1640, operated under VOC supervision. The trees grow in orderly rows, carefully maintained, the volcanic soil rich and productive. Workers, a mix of imported labourers and enslaved Bandanese survivors, tend the trees, harvest the fruit, process the nutmeg and mace, dry the products in the tropical sun. The work is skilled and labour-intensive, each step requiring knowledge and care to produce the quality that European markets demand. The workers receive minimal compensation, enough to survive, but nothing approaching the value their labour creates. The nutmeg they produce will be shipped to Batavia, then loaded on VOC ships for the voyage to Amsterdam, where it will be auctioned for prices hundreds of times what the workers received. The VOC's monopoly was never complete or permanent. Some nutmeg and cloves were smuggled out of the islands the Dutch controlled, sold to competitors, reaching markets through alternative channels. The VOC expended significant resources trying to prevent this smuggling, maintaining patrols, punishing anyone caught, but perfect enforcement was impossible across such vast distances and so many small islands. The leakage was a cost of the monopoly, reducing but not eliminating the extraordinary profits that control of the Spice Islands generated. The opportunity cost of monopoly enforcement was also substantial. The VOC maintained military forces in the Spice Islands, garrisoned forts, operated patrols, all of which required soldiers, ships, weapons, and supplies. These military expenses were justified by the monopoly profits they protected, but they were real costs nonetheless, reducing the net benefit the company and its shareholders derived from the spice trade. The VOC's leadership calculated that the monopoly profits exceeded the enforcement costs, that the investment in military control paid for itself through the higher prices they could charge. But the calculation was never simple, and in later years, as competition increased and prices fell, the wisdom of such heavy military commitments would be questioned. The cultivation of pepper on the Malabar coast, by contrast, was harder to monopolize. Pepper grew across a wide region, in areas controlled by various Indian rulers, sold by numerous cultivators and merchants operating independently. The Portuguese tried to monopolize pepper trade by controlling key ports and requiring all pepper to flow through their trading posts, but enforcement was imperfect. Indian and Arab merchants continued operating, finding ways around Portuguese restrictions, selling pepper to whoever offered good prices. When the Dutch and English arrived, the competition increased further, multiple European companies bidding for pepper alongside indigenous merchants, keeping prices relatively competitive and preventing any single buyer from dominating the market completely. The VOC did establish pepper monopolies in some regions, particularly in parts of Sumatra and Java, where they could exercise political control over local rulers. Contracts were negotiated or imposed, requiring cultivators in these areas to sell pepper exclusively to the VOC at prices the VOC determined. These forced cultivation agreements were economically similar to the monopolies in the Spice Islands, allowing the VOC to purchase at suppressed prices and sell at higher European prices, pocketing the difference. But the geographical extent of pepper cultivation meant that monopoly control was always partial. Significant quantities of pepper continued flowing through channels the VOC didn't control, and pepper prices, while still profitable, never reached the extraordinary multiples that nutmeg and cloves commanded. The spice cultivators themselves, whether in Banda or the Moluccas or Kerala, had limited economic agency under these systems. The monopsony power of the European companies, whether VOC or Portuguese or English, meant that cultivators had little bargaining power. They could accept the prices offered or not sell, but refusing to sell meant forgoing income, and most cultivators needed the income that spice production provided. The alternative crops they might grow, rice or other food staples, were less valuable, and the land suitable for spices was often marginal for other purposes. The spice trees were also long-term investments, taking years to begin producing, representing sunk costs that made it rational to continue harvesting even at low prices rather than abandoning the trees. The cultivators adapted to these constrained circumstances as best they could. Some adulterated their spices, mixing in foreign materials to increase weight and apparent quantity. A rational response to low prices, though one that risked punishment if discovered. Some cultivated small quantities secretly, selling to smugglers who would pay higher prices than the official monopolists. Some simply accepted the terms available, working patiently, their labour generating enormous wealth that flowed to distant shareholders, but providing them only minimal subsistence. The system was exploitative but not chaotic. It had its rules and patterns, and people survived within it, finding small spaces for agency and resistance, even as the overall structure remained oppressive. The Dutch policy of destroying spice trees eventually backfired in ways the VOC couldn't fully control. The knowledge of nutmeg and clove cultivation spread despite Dutch efforts to keep it confined to the islands they controlled. French administrators in Mauritius and other islands managed to obtain seedlings or seeds and successfully established nutmeg and clove cultivation in territories beyond Dutch reach. Pierre Poivre, a French colonial official, led these efforts in the 1770s, smuggling plants from the Spice Islands and establishing them in French possessions. The English did the same in Penang and other Southeast Asian territories they controlled. These alternative sources of supply, developing slowly over decades, would eventually erode the Dutch monopoly completely. The biological reality was that nutmeg and cloves, while particular in their requirements, could grow in places other than their native islands if the right conditions were created. The VOC's monopoly had been based on controlling the natural distribution of these plants, but once the plants were transplanted elsewhere and cultivation knowledge spread, the monopoly became impossible to maintain. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, nutmeg and cloves were being produced in quantities sufficient to affect prices, the supply no longer restricted to the islands the Dutch controlled, the market becoming more competitive as alternative sources developed. The economic logic of monopoly, which had driven so much violence and coercion in the Spice Islands, contained its own destruction. The extraordinary profits that monopoly generated created enormous incentives for others to break the monopoly, to find ways to access the source of those profits. The higher the monopoly profits, the greater the incentive to challenge the monopoly, and eventually someone with sufficient resources and determination would succeed. The VOC's military and political power could delay this outcome but not prevent it indefinitely. The patient work of botanical smuggling, the gradual establishment of cultivation elsewhere, the slow erosion of exclusive control, all of this was inevitable once the profits were large enough to justify the effort required to challenge the monopoly. Picture a clove plantation on Zanzibar in 1800. The trees still young but beginning to produce, the French having successfully transplanted cultivation to this East African island. The workers tend the trees, learning the techniques that had once been exclusive knowledge of the Moluccan islanders, adapting them to local conditions, discovering what works in this new environment. The cloves they harvest will compete with Dutch cloves in global markets, adding to supply, putting downward pressure on prices, gradually eroding the extraordinary profits that monopoly had once generated. The workers in Zanzibar, like those in the original Moluccas, receive minimal compensation for their labour, the structure of exploitation remaining even as the geographic distribution of production shifts. The legacy of monopoly enforcement in the Spice Islands was complex. The violence and coercion had achieved its economic purpose for a time, generating enormous profits for the VOC and its shareholders, enriching Amsterdam and funding the company's vast operations. But the human costs had been substantial, populations displaced or destroyed, cultures disrupted, people forced into labour systems that denied them fair compensation for their work. The environmental costs, the destruction of trees and ecosystems in the pursuit of supply control were also significant, and ultimately the monopoly proved unsustainable, the forces of competition and botanical distribution overcoming even the most ruthless enforcement efforts. The economic lesson, clear in retrospect though not always recognised at the time, was that monopolies based on controlling natural resources are inherently vulnerable. As long as the resource can be found or cultivated elsewhere, as long as the knowledge of production can spread, as long as the profits are large enough to motivate competitors, the monopoly will eventually erode. The more extreme the measures taken to enforce the monopoly, the more violence and coercion applied, the greater the incentive for others to find ways around the restrictions. The VOC's century of dominance in the Spice Islands was impressive but temporary, a moment in the longer history of these products moving from monopoly luxury to competitive commodity. The spices themselves continued growing on their original islands and on new islands where they had been transplanted, the trees unconcerned with the human conflicts and economic calculations that surrounded them. The nutmeg trees in Banda continued producing, as they had for centuries before the Dutch arrived, and would continue for centuries after Dutch control ended. The clove trees in the Moluccas kept blooming, kept being harvested, the work of cultivation continuing regardless of who claimed ownership or how the profits were distributed. The patient rhythms of agricultural life, planting and tending and harvesting and processing, these persisted through all the changes in political control and economic organization, the fundamental work of producing the spices remaining similar even as everything around it transformed. The violence and exploitation that secured monopoly control over spice production, the long journeys and patient accumulation of markups, all of this economic machinery existed to serve desire. European consumers wanted spices badly enough to pay extraordinary prices, and understanding why requires looking beyond simple economics into the realm of belief, culture, and the complex human relationship with substances that altered how food tasted and how bodies felt. The prices that pepper and nutmeg commanded were not arbitrary, but reflected genuine demand. Desires rooted in the material conditions and cultural assumptions of medieval and early modern European life. The most practical reason Europeans valued spices was preservation. Meat spoiled quickly in a world without refrigeration, and the seasons meant that livestock were often slaughtered in autumn, the meat needing to last through winter months when fresh meat was unavailable. Salt was the primary preservative, but salt alone produced meat that was unappetizing, the taste harsh and monotonous. Spices helped mask the flavor of salted meat, made preserved food more palatable, allowed people to consume stores that might otherwise have been difficult to eat. Pepper's sharp bite, ginger's warming heat, cinnamon's sweet pungency, all of these provided flavor that broke the monotony of salt-preserved food. But preservation alone doesn't fully explain the quantities of spices that wealthy households consumed, or the prices they willingly paid. The actual preservation value of spices was modest and far cheaper. Local herbs could have served similar purposes. The explanation requires understanding medieval medical theory and the genuine belief that spices had therapeutic properties. Medieval European medicine was based largely on humoral theory, inherited from ancient Greek physicians and elaborated by Islamic medical scholars. This theory held that health depended on balance among four humours in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, each associated with qualities of hot, cold, wet, and dry. Spices were believed to have strong heating and drying properties. Pepper, according to this theory, could warm a cold stomach, aid digestion, expel phlegm from the body. Ginger was thought to be even more heating, useful for treating colds and respiratory complaints. Nutmeg was considered warming and slightly narcotic, helpful for digestive troubles and insomnia. Cloves were believed to strengthen the heart and stimulate the brain. These beliefs were not casual superstitions, but formed part of a coherent medical system that educated physicians took seriously and prescribed accordingly. A wealthy person suffering from what we would now recognize as a cold might be prescribed a mixture of wine, honey, and pepper. The pepper's heating qualities expected to counteract the cold humours causing the illness. The medical beliefs extended to plague prevention. particularly after the Black Death of the 14th century, made epidemic disease a recurring nightmare for European populations. Nutmeg was especially prized as a plague preventative. Wealthy people, carrying nutmegs in small boxes, taking them out periodically to inhale the scent, believing the strong aroma would ward off the corrupted air that was thought to spread plague. During plague outbreaks, the demand for nutmeg would spike, prices rising even higher than their normally elevated levels, desperate people paying whatever was asked for something they believed might save their lives. The belief was mistaken. Nutmeg provides no protection against plague, but the sincere conviction that it might drove purchasing decisions and sustained high prices even during periods of economic disruption. The culinary uses of spices in medieval European cooking were elaborate and distinctive. Cookbooks from the period, written for wealthy households that could afford both the ingredients and the cooks skilled enough to prepare complex dishes, call for spices in combinations and quantities that seem extravagant. A sauce might require a quarter pound of pepper, several ounces of ginger, generous amounts of cinnamon, cloves, and grains of paradise, an African spice that added its own pungent heat. These heavily spiced dishes were not attempts to cover the flavour of spoiled meat, as is sometimes suggested. The wealthy households using these recipes had access to fresh meat and wouldn't tolerate spoiled food. Rather, the heavy spicing was the fashion, the preferred flavour profile, the mark of sophisticated cuisine. The taste preferences were genuinely different from modern European palates. Medieval diners enjoyed combinations of sweet and savoury, dishes that might include meat, dried fruits, honey, and heavy doses of warming spices, creating flavours that would seem strange to contemporary eaters. The recipes were influenced by contact with Islamic cuisine, which had its own sophisticated spice-using traditions, adapted to European ingredients and preferences, but retaining the emphasis on complex spicing. A feast at a noble household might feature a dozen or more courses, many of them elaborately spiced, the cumulative effect a demonstration of wealth and access to rare ingredients. The social function of spices, their role in displaying status and marking special occasions, was as important as their practical or medicinal uses. Serving heavily spiced food to guests demonstrated that the host commanded resources sufficient to purchase expensive imports, that the household was prosperous and well connected enough to access goods that had travelled from distant lands. The cost of the spices in a single elaborate dish might equal a labourer's wages for weeks, and everyone at the table understood this, understood that they were consuming not just food but wealth made edible, enjoying the host's generosity and the implicit statement about his social position. Spices appeared in wedding feasts, marking the importance of the occasion and the family's investment in the union being celebrated. They were given as gifts, small quantities of pepper or ginger or cinnamon, presented in decorative containers, valued both for their utility and for their rarity. They appeared in religious ceremonies, frankincense and myrrh being the most obvious examples, but other spices also used in church rituals or festivals. The social and cultural meanings of spices were layered and complex, extending far beyond simple seasoning or preservation. The economic theory of luxury goods helps explain why high prices didn't reduce demand as classical economics might predict. For some goods, higher prices actually increased desirability, a phenomenon economists would later name after Thorstein Veblen, who analysed conspicuous consumption in the late 1800s. But the pattern was already operating in medieval spice markets. Spices were partly valued because they were expensive, because possessing and using them demonstrated wealth and status. If prices had fallen dramatically, making spices accessible to everyone, they would have lost some of their social value, the signalling function that made them desirable to the wealthy. The high prices were not just an unfortunate barrier to consumption, but part of what made consumption meaningful. This doesn't mean demand was completely price insensitive. When prices rose too high, even wealthy consumers would reduce their consumption or substitute cheaper alternatives. When prices fell, as they did gradually over the 16th and 17th centuries, consumption did expand. More people incorporating spices into their cooking, the market broadening down the social hierarchy. But the demand curve for spices was relatively inelastic, especially for the wealthy, meaning that significant price changes produced smaller changes in the quantity demanded. People who wanted spices for medical reasons or for social display, or because they genuinely enjoyed the flavors, would pay high prices and adjust consumption only moderately as prices fluctuated. The response to high prices included various forms of adulteration and substitution that created secondary markets and enforcement challenges. Ground spices were especially vulnerable to adulteration. Unscrupulous merchants mixing genuine pepper with cheaper substances like juniper berries or adding flour to ground nutmeg to increase bulk. The adulteration was economically rational from the merchant's perspective, increasing profits by substituting cheap inputs for expensive ones, while charging prices based on the valuable spices customers believed they were purchasing. But it created problems of quality control and trust, buyers uncertain whether they were receiving genuine spices or adulterated mixtures. The guilds that regulated trade in medieval cities attempted to prevent adulteration through inspection and harsh penalties. The London Grocers Company, which controlled the spice trade in England's capital, had authority to inspect shops and warehouses, seize adulterated goods, and punish merchants who violated quality standards. Similar guilds existed in other European cities, each one trying to maintain the reputation of their members and protect consumers from fraud. The regulations were reasonably effective but imperfect. The incentives for adulteration remained strong, and some fraudulent goods undoubtedly reached consumers despite the oversight. Substitution with local products was another response to high spice prices. Various European plants could provide some pungency or aromatic quality, if not the exact flavor of imported spices. Mustard seed, grown locally, could be ground into a paste that provided heat. Native herbs like sage, thyme, and rosemary added flavor to food. These substitutes were imperfect. They didn't taste like pepper or ginger, but they were affordable, and for households that couldn't afford imported spices, they were better than nothing. The culinary traditions of poorer Europeans developed around these local ingredients, creating flavor profiles quite different from the heavily spiced cuisine of the wealthy. Picture a merchant's household in Bristol in 1450, preparing for a wedding feast. The household steward meets with the cook to plan the menu, discussing which dishes will be served, what ingredients are needed. The cook mentions that several recipes require substantial quantities of spices, listing amounts, the steward calculating costs. 1/4 pound of pepper for the sauce, 3 ounces of ginger for the sweetmeats, nutmeg and cloves for the wine. The total cost of spices for the feast will be several pounds, a substantial portion of the overall expense, but the merchant has decided this is necessary. His daughter's wedding requires proper display. The guests will expect elaborate food. The family's reputation demands generosity. The steward sends a servant to the shop of a grocer who imports spices through Venetian merchants, the goods having travelled from India or Indonesia through the Mediterranean to Bristol. The grocer weighs out the quantities requested. The spices stored in locked chests to prevent theft, each variety kept separate to avoid confusion. The servant returns to the household with packages wrapped in cloth, the spices to be stored carefully until the feast day approaches. The cook will grind what's needed using a mortar and pestle, the work requiring time and effort. Each spice ground fresh because ground spices lose potency quickly. The oils that carry the flavour dissipating when exposed to air. On the feast day, guests arrive to find tables laden with dishes, meats and fish and fowl, all of them prepared with the elaborate spicing that marks the occasion as special. The conversation includes comments on the food, compliments to the host on his generosity, observations about the quality of the spices used. The social function of the meal is being fulfilled, relationships reinforced, alliances acknowledged, the merchant's position in the community's hierarchy confirmed through his ability to provide abundantly. The spices that travelled so far, that cost so much, are serving purposes that extend far beyond nutrition or flavour, functioning as social lubricant, status marker, and medium through which relationships are conducted and maintained. The gradual democratization of spice consumption over the 16th and 17th centuries reflected both falling prices and rising incomes. As Portuguese and then Dutch direct trade reduced the markups that Venetian intermediaries had added, as the competition between multiple European trading companies put pressure on monopoly pricing, as shipping became more efficient and regular, the prices European consumers paid declined slowly but steadily. A pound of pepper that cost 2 shillings in London in 1500 might cost 1 shilling by 1600 and perhaps 8 pence by 1700. The decline not dramatic in any single year, but substantial when accumulated over generations. At the same time, economic growth in parts of Europe meant that more people had income sufficient to afford small quantities of spices. The expanding merchant and artisan classes, prosperous but not wealthy, began incorporating spices into their cooking in modest amounts. A household might purchase a few ounces of pepper rather than pounds, use it sparingly, make it last for months. This expanding market, reaching down into the middling classes, helped sustain overall demand even as the luxury market that had driven high prices began to saturate. The total quantity of spices imported into Europe grew substantially during the 16th and 17th centuries, even as prices per unit weight declined, the market becoming broader if less lucrative per transaction. The changing relationship between price and social meaning created interesting dynamics. Pepper, which had been a luxury in the medieval period, became increasingly common by the 17th century, accessible to people of modest means, its social signalling value diminishing as its availability increased. Nutmeg and cloves, being rarer and more expensive, retained their luxury status longer. But eventually they too became more accessible, their prices falling as supply increased and monopolies eroded. The process was gradual and uneven, different spices moving from luxury to ordinary at different rates, the social meanings shifting as economic realities changed. The persistence of spice use even as prices fell and social meanings changed suggests that genuine appreciation for the flavours was developing alongside and eventually overtaking the status considerations. People who'd grown up eating spiced food came to prefer those flavors, to find unseasoned food bland by comparison. The taste preferences were becoming embedded in culinary culture, recipes passed down through families, regional cuisines developing distinctive spicing patterns. English cooking retained some use of spices, but became less heavily spiced over time. Dutch cuisine, perhaps surprisingly given the Netherlands' dominance in the spice trade, never became as spice-intensive as one might expect. French cuisine developed elaborate sauce traditions that use spices more subtly than medieval recipes had. Each region's food culture evolved in its own direction, shaped partly by spice availability, but also by other factors, by indigenous ingredients, by foreign influences, by the accumulated weight of tradition and preference. The medical beliefs about spices persisted even as their economic status changed. Throughout the 17th and into the 18th century, physicians continued prescribing spices for various ailments, the humoral theory remaining dominant in European medicine even as its limitations became increasingly apparent. The transition to modern medical understanding was slow, and during this transition period spices remained part of the pharmacopoeia, sold in apothecary shops alongside other medicinal substances, their therapeutic properties still taken seriously even if we now recognize those properties as largely imaginary. Picture an apothecary shop in Amsterdam in 1680. The shelves lined with jars and bottles containing various substances. The apothecary, consulted by a customer complaining of digestive trouble, recommends a preparation including ginger and pepper mixed with wine and honey, the spices to be taken daily until the symptoms improve. The customer pays for the prescription, trusting the apothecary's expertise, believing that the spices will help. Whether the preparation has any therapeutic effect beyond placebo is doubtful, but the customer's belief is genuine, as is the apothecary's, and the transaction serves both parties' needs. The customer receiving treatment he believes will help, the apothecary earning his fee for applying his professional knowledge. The reasons Europeans paid so much for spices then were multiple and reinforcing. Practical preservation needs, sincere medical beliefs, social status display, genuine appreciation for the flavors, cultural expectations about appropriate food for different occasions. All of these factors combined to create and sustain demand. The demand wasn't irrational, though some of the beliefs underlying it were mistaken. It was rational given the knowledge and assumptions of the time, given the social structures and cultural meanings that food carried, given the genuine pleasure that spiced food provided to people who enjoyed those flavors. The extraordinary prices that pepper and nutmeg commanded weren't simply the result of supply constraints, though those were important. They reflected demand that was strong, relatively inelastic, and based on needs and desires that felt compelling to the people experiencing them, even if those needs and desires seemed strange or excessive from the perspective of a later age, with different tastes and different understandings of nutrition and medicine. The extraordinary prices that spices had commanded for centuries, the profits that had justified violence and monopoly enforcement, the status meanings that had made pepper worth more than gold by weight, all of this was built on scarcity. As long as supply remained constrained and demand remained strong, the economic structure could persist. But scarcity maintained through monopoly is always vulnerable, and by the middle of the 17th century, the forces that would eventually collapse spice prices were already in motion. The transformation would be gradual, playing out over more than a century. but its direction was clear to anyone watching the markets carefully. Spices were beginning their long journey from luxury goods to everyday commodities. The fundamental change was increased competition among suppliers. The Portuguese monopoly on direct Asian trade had given way to competition from multiple European powers by the early 1600s. The Dutch VOC, the English East India Company, various French trading companies, even Danish and Swedish ventures, all of these organizations were sending ships to Asia, establishing trading posts, negotiating with local rulers, purchasing spices and other goods for European markets. This multiplication of buyers meant that Asian suppliers had more options, could negotiate better prices, weren't entirely dependent on a single monopolistic purchaser. The monopsony power that had allowed Europeans to suppress the prices paid to cultivators was eroding, not completely, but enough to affect costs. The competition also meant that European markets received spices from multiple sources. A merchant in London could purchase pepper from the English East India Company, or sometimes from Dutch merchants, or through various intermediaries who obtained supplies from multiple sources. This competitive market structure put pressure on prices, prevented any single company from charging monopoly prices without losing market share to competitors. The VOC still attempted to maintain monopoly control over nutmeg and cloves from the specific islands they dominated, but even there, smuggling and alternative sources were beginning to create competition that Dutch military power couldn't entirely suppress. The successful transplantation of spice cultivation to new regions was perhaps the most fundamental blow to the old monopoly structure. The French efforts to establish nutmeg and clove cultivation in Mauritius and other Indian Ocean islands, which began in earnest in the 1760s and 1770s, proved that these spices could grow outside their original narrow geographic ranges. Pierre Poivre, serving as administrator of French possessions in the Indian Ocean, organised expeditions to smuggle seedlings and seeds from Dutch-controlled islands, transported them carefully to French territories, and oversaw their establishment in new environments. The work required patience. Many plants died during transport or failed to thrive in their new locations, but enough succeeded to establish viable cultivation. The English did similar work in their Southeast Asian possessions, particularly Penang, where nutmeg cultivation was established in the late 1700s. The transplantation didn't happen quickly. The trees took years to mature, the early harvest was small, the techniques needed to be adapted to new climates and soils. But by the early 1800s, these alternative sources were producing nutmeg and cloves in quantities sufficient to affect global supply meaningfully. The Dutch monopoly on these most valuable spices was breaking, not through military defeat but through botanical dispersal and patient agricultural development. Pepper cultivation also expanded geographically. While pepper had never been as monopolized as nutmeg or cloves, the growth of cultivation in new regions, particularly in parts of Indonesia outside Dutch control, added to supply and intensified competition. The British encouraged pepper cultivation in their possessions, seeing it as valuable export crop. Local cultivators, recognizing the profit opportunities, planted pepper vines on land that had previously grown other crops. The expansion was driven by market signals, high prices for pepper making cultivation attractive, the increased cultivation gradually adding to supply and putting downward pressure on those prices. The prices themselves tell the story of this transformation. Pepper in London, which had cost approximately 2 shillings per pound in the early 1600s, declined to perhaps 1 shilling by the late 1600s and continued falling through the 1700s. By 1800, pepper might cost 6 pence per pound in London, a quarter of what it had cost 2 centuries earlier. The decline wasn't steady or uniform. Wars and harvest failures and speculative bubbles created fluctuations, but the long-term trend was clear and inexorable. Pepper was becoming cheaper, more accessible, less precious. Nutmeg and cloves, starting from higher price points and more complete monopoly control, declined more slowly but still significantly. A pound of nutmeg that might have cost several pounds sterling in the early 1600s might cost £1 by the mid-1700s, and perhaps 10 shillings by early 1800s. The prices remained high by absolute standards, still representing substantial expenditure for most households, but the direction was unmistakable. The extraordinary multiples over origin prices were shrinking as competition eroded monopoly power and supply expanded to meet demand more fully. The impact on European consumers was gradual but transformative. As prices fell, more people could afford to purchase spices, the market broadening down the social hierarchy. Artisan households that had only occasionally purchased small quantities of pepper began using it more regularly. Shopkeepers and skilled workers, prosperous but not wealthy, incorporated spices into their cooking in amounts that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. The democratization of consumption proceeded slowly, each generation finding spices slightly more accessible than their parents had, the cumulative effect over decades being substantial. The changing prices also affected how spices were used. When pepper was extraordinarily expensive, households used it sparingly, grinding small amounts as needed, making a little go a long way. As prices fell, the careful husbanding of expensive ingredients became less necessary. Pepper shakers began appearing on tables, people adding pepper to food according to taste rather than rationing it carefully. The transition from luxury to everyday seasoning was gradual, occurring at different rates in different social classes and different regions, but the overall direction was toward casual use that would have seemed wasteful to earlier generations. The social meaning of spices changed along with their economic status. Serving heavily spiced food had once been a mark of wealth and status, a demonstration of access to rare imports. As spices became more common, this signalling value diminished. Wealthy households still used spices, often in higher quality varieties or in elaborate preparations, but simple possession of pepper or nutmeg no longer marked one as prosperous. The status competition moved to other goods, perhaps sugar, which was beginning its own transformation from luxury to commodity during this period, or tea and coffee, or manufactured goods that were becoming available through expanding trade networks. The trading companies that had profited so handsomely from spice monopolies faced declining margins as prices fell and competition intensified. The VOC, which had paid generous dividends to shareholders during the 17th century, partly from spice trade profits, found this source of revenue diminishing in the 18th century. The company adapted by diversifying increasing trade in other commodities like coffee, tea and textiles, but the spice trade that had originally justified the company's formation was becoming less central to its operations and less profitable per unit sold, even as volume increased. Picture a warehouse in Amsterdam in 1750, the VOC's main storage facility, vast spaces filled with goods from Asia. One section holds sacks of pepper, stacked to the ceiling, quantities that would have seemed impossible a century earlier. The warehouse manager walks through, calculating how much can be released to market, but his calculations are different now than they would have been in 1650. Then, the goal was to restrict supply to maintain high prices. Now, with competition from other companies and alternative sources, restricting supply simply means losing market share. The strategy has shifted toward volume, moving larger quantities at lower margins, accepting smaller profits per pound in exchange for selling more pounds. The company's accountants recorded these changes in their ledgers, the careful columns of figures showing revenues and expenses, profits and losses. The spice revenues, while still substantial in absolute terms, were declining as a percentage of total trade. Coffee was becoming more important, the demand for coffee growing rapidly in Europe, even as spice demand, while not declining, was growing more slowly. Tea was emerging as another significant commodity, particularly for trade with England, where tea, drinking, was becoming a national habit. The textiles, both from India and increasingly from company-operated manufacturers in the East Indies, were generating growing revenues. The company was evolving, its profit sources diversifying, the spice trade that had been central to its founding becoming just one part of a broader commercial portfolio. The impact on Asian cultivators was mixed. The expansion of cultivation meant more people earning income from spice production, but the falling prices meant less income per unit produced. A pepper farmer in Sumatra in 1780 might grow more pepper than his grandfather had in 1680. Might sell larger quantities, but the price per pound was lower, and the total income might not be substantially higher. The increased volume compensated partially for lower prices, but not entirely, and cultivators found themselves working harder to maintain income levels that had previously required less production. The monopsony power of the trading companies, while eroded by competition among European buyers, still kept prices paid to cultivators below what a truly competitive market might have produced. The companies competed with each other for European markets, but often tacitly cooperated in keeping prices paid to Asian suppliers relatively low. A cultivator selling to the VOC in one region and another cultivator selling to the English East India Company in a different region both received prices that reflected the buyer's power advantage, even though the buyers competed with each other downstream. The structure preserved some of the inequality inherent in the earlier monopoly system, even as overall competition increased. The smuggling that had always occurred around the edges of monopoly control became more significant as price differentials persisted. Local merchants who could obtain spices outside official channels and sell them to competing European companies or to indigenous trading networks earned profits from arbitrage, moving goods from lower price to higher price markets. The companies attempted to prevent this leakage, but enforcement was difficult across such vast distances with so many small islands and ports. The smuggling represented a form of market efficiency, goods flowing toward their highest value uses despite official restrictions, but it also represented a cost and frustration for the companies trying to maintain control. The Dutch policy of destroying spice trees outside their controlled territories continued into the 18th century, but became increasingly futile as cultivation spread. VOC ships still conducted expeditions to burn unauthorized nutmeg and clove trees, but the effort was like trying to hold back the tide. For every tree destroyed, others were planted elsewhere, the knowledge of cultivation spreading despite Dutch efforts to contain it. The policy, which had once been economically rational as a way of maintaining monopoly, became an expensive anachronism, absorbing resources without achieving its intended effect. The Napoleonic Wars in the late 1700s and early 1800s accelerated the breakdown of European monopoly control over spice sources. When France occupied the Netherlands during the 1790s, the VOC's operations were disrupted, its Asian possessions vulnerable to seizure by Britain and other rivals. The British did seize some Dutch territories temporarily, including key spice-producing islands, and during this period of British control, the barriers to transplanting spice cultivation to British possessions became even weaker. When territories were eventually returned to Dutch control, the damage to the monopoly structure was permanent. The spices now grew in multiple regions under multiple political jurisdictions, and no single power could control supply comprehensively. The price declines were not universally welcomed. European consumers obviously benefited from paying less for spices, their real income effectively rising as the cost of goods they desired fell. But merchants and investors who had profited from the spice trade saw their margins compress, their returns decline, their business model undercut by competition and increased supply. The cultivators, as mentioned, experienced mixed effects, gaining from expanded markets but losing from lower prices. The trading companies adapted where they could, shifting focus to other commodities, but some participants in the traditional spice trade simply declined, their businesses no longer viable in the new competitive environment. Picture a merchant in Venice in 1770. His family having been in the spice trade for generations, his grandfather and great-grandfather having prospered in the days when Venice was the dominant European spice entrepot. He sits in his counting house reviewing his accounts, recognizing that the business that supported his family for so long is no longer as profitable as it once was. The spice trade continues. Venice still handles significant volumes, but the margins are thinner, the competition more intense, the profits insufficient to maintain the lifestyle his ancestors enjoyed. He is diversifying, investing in other trades, adjusting to new realities, but there is a sense of something ending, a transformation that cannot be reversed. The transformation of spices from luxury to commodity was not complete by 1800. That final stage would require another century or more, but the direction was established. The economic forces driving the change were inexorable. As long as spices could be cultivated in multiple locations by multiple suppliers, as long as European companies competed for market share, as long as transport technology continued improving and making shipping less expensive, prices would continue falling. The monopoly profits that had justified empires and violence were disappearing, replaced by the thinner margins of competitive trade, the bulk, commerce where profit came from volume rather than extreme markups. The social and cultural meanings of spices were adapting to these economic changes. The elaborate medieval recipes calling for extravagant quantities of expensive spices were fading from cookbooks, replaced by more moderate use of spices as flavor enhancers rather than status markers. European cuisines were evolving in different directions, some retaining more spice use, others moving towards styles that emphasized other ingredients and techniques. The Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and other regions where spices were indigenous or had been used for millennia continued their own spice-intensive culinary traditions that had never been primarily about status display, but rather about the flavors that local palates preferred. The medical beliefs about spices were also beginning to erode as European medicine slowly moved away from humoral theory toward modern scientific understanding. By the late 1700s, physicians were becoming more skeptical of traditional remedies, including spices, as new knowledge about anatomy, chemistry, and disease causation developed. The transition was slow and incomplete, traditional beliefs persisting alongside new knowledge, but the direction was toward recognizing that spices had limited therapeutic value, that their primary function was flavoring rather than healing. This shift further reduced the premium that medical demand had contributed to spice prices. The story of spice price decline is a story about markets working, about competition eroding monopoly, about supply responding to high prices by expanding until prices fell to levels closer to production costs, plus reasonable profit margins. It's also a story about knowledge spreading, about plants crossing boundaries, about human ingenuity finding ways around restrictions. And it's a story about transformation, about goods that had been precious becoming ordinary, about economic structures that had seemed permanent proving temporary, about the constant process of change that characterizes commercial life, even when that change occurs slowly enough that any single generation might barely notice it happening. The pepper that had been worth more than gold was becoming worth less than silver, on its way to becoming worth less than copper, eventually to be scattered freely across food with no thought for its cost, the transformation complete, the extraordinary becoming mundane through the patient work of markets and cultivation and competition unfolding across centuries. The falling prices and spreading cultivation of spices, the transformation from luxury to commodity that unfolded across the 17th and 18th centuries, these changes were embedded in and enabled by innovations in how commerce itself was organized and financed. The spice trade had always been capital intensive, requiring large sums invested for long periods with uncertain returns, and the challenges of financing such trade had driven the development of financial instruments and institutions that would prove useful far beyond the spice business itself. The mechanisms created to move pepper from India to Europe, to spread risk among investors, to provide liquidity when capital was tied up in ships at sea, these became foundations of modern finance. The joint stock company structure, which we encountered in our journey through the VOC's history, was itself partly a response to the financial demands of the spice trade. The traditional partnership model, where merchants pooled capital for a single voyage and dissolved the partnership when the voyage concluded, worked adequately for short-distance trade where capital turned over quickly. But for voyages to Asia that required years before any return was realized, the partnership model was inefficient. Capital remained locked up too long, investors had no way to recover their funds if circumstances changed. The need to repeatedly assemble capital for each new voyage created transaction costs and uncertainty. The permanent capital structure that the VOC pioneered in 1602 solved these problems. Investors committed capital indefinitely. The company used that capital for ongoing operations, and investors who needed liquidity could sell their shares to others rather than withdrawing capital from the company. This innovation separated ownership from operations in new ways, allowing the company to plan long-term investments knowing the capital would remain available, while giving investors flexibility through the secondary market in shares. The structure was so successful that it spread. Other trading companies adopted similar models, and eventually corporations in industries having nothing to do with spices used the same basic architecture. The insurance market developed in close connection with maritime trade, and spice shipments were among the highest value cargoes requiring insurance. A ship carrying pepper and nutmeg from the East Indies to Europe might represent capital value of tens of thousands of pounds, and the loss of such a ship to storm or piracy or other misfortune would be catastrophic for the merchants who owned the cargo. Insurance provided a way to transfer this risk from those who couldn't bear it to those willing to accept it for a price. The underwriters who accepted maritime insurance risks were essentially betting that the premiums they collected from many shipments would exceed the claims they had to pay for the few ships that were lost. Edward Lloyd's Coffee House in London, which opened in 1686, became the centre of maritime insurance in England. Ship captains and merchants gathered there to share information about voyages, winds and conditions in various ports. Underwriters also congregated there, willing to insure ships and cargoes for appropriate premiums. The mechanism was simple in principle. A merchant with cargo to insure would present the details of the voyage, the ship, the cargo value and the route. Underwriters would assess the risks and quote premiums, perhaps 12 to 15% of cargo value for a voyage to the East Indies, reflecting the substantial risks involved. If the merchant accepted the terms, the underwriter would write his name under the risk details, committing to pay a proportional share of any loss, hence the term underwriter. The insurance premium itself became a cost that had to be recovered in the price charge for spices in Europe. A cargo of pepper that cost £10,000 to purchase in India might require £1,500 of insurance premiums for the voyage to England. This insurance cost, along with the ship's operating expenses, crew wages, port duties, and the merchant's desired profit, all accumulated into the final price. The insurance didn't reduce the risk of loss. Ships still sank regardless of insurance, but it distributed the financial consequences of loss across many parties, preventing any single loss from bankrupting the merchants involved. The development of maritime insurance also created new forms of specialized knowledge and expertise. Underwriters needed to assess risks accurately to set premiums that were high enough to cover expected losses, but not so high that merchants would choose to sail uninsured or seek insurance elsewhere. This required understanding ship construction and maintenance, knowledge of particular captains' competence and caution, information about piracy and political conflicts in various regions, assessment of seasonal weather patterns and their effects on different routes. The accumulated knowledge of underwriters, developed through years of experience and careful record-keeping, became valuable intellectual capital, an information advantage that successful underwriters exploited to earn profits from risk-taking. Another financial innovation emerging from the spice trade was the development of forward contracts and options. The long-time lag between ordering spices in Asia and receiving them in Europe, combined with price volatility in European markets, created uncertainty that both buyers and sellers wanted to manage. A merchant who had ordered a shipment of pepper expected to arrive in 6 months faced price risk. If pepper prices fell during those 6 months, the cargo he had bought at previous prices might not be profitable to sell at current prices. Conversely, if prices rose, he would benefit handsomely, but the uncertainty was uncomfortable. Forward contracts allowed merchants to lock in prices for future delivery. A merchant expecting a pepper shipment in 6 months might contract to sell that pepper at a fixed price to another merchant who wanted to secure supply. The transaction happened before the pepper arrived, the price agreed upon based on both parties' expectations of future market conditions. If pepper prices fell below the contract price, The seller benefited, having locked in a higher price. If prices rose above the contract price, the buyer benefited, having secured supply at a lower price than currently prevailed. The contract transferred price risk from one party to another, allowing each to manage their exposure according to their risk tolerance and market views. Options contracts, which gave the right but not the obligation to buy or sell at fixed prices, added another layer of flexibility. A merchant uncertain about future spice supply might purchase an option, giving him the right to buy pepper at a specified price 6 months hence. He would pay a premium for this option, perhaps 5% of the contracted value. If pepper prices rose above the option strike price, he could exercise the option, purchasing pepper at the lower contracted price and immediately reselling at the higher market price, earning profit that would exceed the premium paid. If pepper prices fell below the strike price, he could let the option expire unexercised, losing only the premium paid. The option provided insurance against price increases without requiring him to commit to the purchase if prices fell. These derivative instruments, forward contracts and options, emerged gradually through the 17th century in Amsterdam and London, developed by merchants seeking ways to manage the uncertainties inherent in long-distance trade. The contracts were initially informal, documented in letters and agreements between parties who knew each other, enforced through reputation and commercial relationships. Over time, the contracts became more standardized, with common terms and expiration dates, making them easier to trade and allowing secondary markets to develop, where the contracts themselves could be bought and sold separate from the underlying commodities. The bill of exchange, an instrument that had been used in medieval trade, became more sophisticated and widely used during the expansion of the spice trade. A merchant in London purchasing spices in India faced the problem of payment. Sending gold or silver to India was expensive and risky, adding to transaction costs. The bill of exchange provided an alternative. The London merchant would draw a bill on a correspondent in India or on an Indian merchant with whom he had a relationship, essentially writing a promise that the correspondent would pay the spice seller a specified sum at a specified future date. The spice seller, if he trusted the creditworthiness of the parties involved, would accept this bill as payment. The correspondent in India, having paid the spice seller, would then need to recover the funds from the London merchant. This might happen through a reverse transaction, the Indian correspondent shipping goods to London that the London merchant would sell, using the proceeds to settle the bill. Or the settlement might involve offsetting transactions through a network of correspondents in multiple cities, the actual flow of gold and silver minimized by netting out debts and credits across many transactions. This complex web of bills of exchange and offsetting transactions allowed international trade to function with far less physical movement of precious metals than the trade volumes would otherwise have required. The credit relationships underlying bills of exchange were based on trust and reputation, developed over years of successful transactions. A merchant whose bills were always honoured developed a reputation for creditworthiness, making it easier to use bills of exchange in future transactions. A merchant who defaulted or whose bills were dishonoured lost his reputation, making it difficult to conduct business. This reputational enforcement mechanism, while not perfect, worked reasonably well in the relatively small world of international merchants, where information about behaviour spread through networks and repeated interactions made long-term reputation valuable. Picture a counting house in Amsterdam in 1700, a merchant sitting at his desk reviewing correspondence from his agent in Batavia. The letters, which took 6 months to arrive, describe spice purchases made, prices paid, quantities shipped on various VOC vessels. The merchant calculates the expected arrival time, estimates likely prices in Amsterdam when the goods arrive, considers whether to sell the spices immediately upon arrival or hold them in storage hoping for price increases. He drafts a bill of exchange to settle his account with the Batavia agent, the bill to be paid 6 months hence, giving him time to sell the arriving spices and generate the cash needed to honour the bill. The accounting practices necessary to manage these complex financial arrangements became more sophisticated through the spice trade era. The VOC's accountants, whom we encountered earlier, developed methods for tracking assets and liabilities across time and space, for valuing inventory that wouldn't be sold for years, for distinguishing capital from revenue, for consolidating financial information from operations spanning 3 continents. These accounting innovations, born from practical necessity, became standards that other organizations adopted and refined, eventually forming the basis for modern corporate accounting. The concept of depreciation, recognizing that ships and other long-lived assets lose value over time, was worked out partly through experience with trading companies. A ship might last 10 or 15 years if properly maintained, making perhaps 3 or 4 voyages to Asia during its working life. The ship's cost needed to be allocated across the voyages it would make, recognized as an expense gradually rather than all at once when the ship was purchased. The accountants developed depreciation schedules, systematic ways of allocating costs over time, ensuring that each voyage bore an appropriate share of the ship's cost. This might seem obvious now, but in the early 1600s it was a conceptual innovation, a new way of thinking about costs and value. The time value of money, the recognition that a pound received today is worth more than a pound received in the future, was understood implicitly by merchants who had always charged interest on loans and offered discounts for early payment. But the spice trade, with its especially long time horizons, made this concept more salient and encouraged more explicit calculations. A cargo of spices purchased in India for £10,000 and sold in Europe 2 years later for £20,000 represented a 100% return, but not all of that was profit. The capital was tied up for 2 years, during which it couldn't be used for other purposes, and the merchant had forgone 2 years of potential returns from alternative investments. Proper calculation of profit required accounting for this opportunity cost of capital. The merchants and their accountants developed rules of thumb for these calculations. A return of 30% on capital employed for 1 year might be considered good. A return of 80% on capital employed for 2 years might be considered acceptable, representing roughly 35% per year compounded. The calculations were approximate rather than precise. The mathematical tools for exactly computing present values and internal rates of return wouldn't be developed until much later, but the merchants understood the basic principle and made judgments accordingly. The spice trade, by requiring capital to be committed for such extended periods, forced this kind of thinking in ways that shorter-term trade didn't. The warehouse receipt, a document certifying that certain goods were stored in a particular warehouse, became a proto-security that could be traded separate from the goods themselves. A merchant might store pepper in an Amsterdam warehouse, receive a receipt documenting the quantity and quality, and then sell that receipt to another merchant rather than physically moving the pepper. the receipt functioned like a share of stock or a bond, a paper instrument representing claim to a valuable asset, easier and safer to transfer than the underlying asset itself. Secondary markets developed where these receipts were traded, the prices reflecting both the value of the underlying spices and any changes in market conditions since the spices had been warehoused. The coffee houses where merchants gathered became informal exchanges where not just spices but also shares, insurance contracts, bills of exchange and warehouse receipts were traded. The physical space facilitated commerce by providing a location where buyers and sellers could find each other, where information could be shared, where prices could be discovered through negotiation and consensus. The coffee house owners sometimes provided additional services, maintaining reading rooms with newspapers and commercial publications, offering writing materials and private rooms for confidential negotiations, serving as informal clearing houses where accounts could be settled and transactions recorded. The evolution from informal coffeehouse trading to organized exchanges with formal rules and listed prices happened gradually over the 18th century. The Amsterdam Exchange, the London Stock Exchange, other organized markets developed structures and procedures that brought order and transparency to trading that had been more casual. Prices were posted, trading hours established, rules created for settling disputes and ensuring that contracts were honoured. These organised exchanges reduced transaction costs and improved market efficiency, making it easier to trade and increasing confidence that transactions would be completed as agreed. Picture the Amsterdam Exchange on a busy trading day in 1750. The large hall filled with merchants moving between different sections where various commodities and securities were traded. In one corner, VOC shares are changing hands, buyers and sellers negotiating prices, clerks recording transactions. In another section, pepper futures are being traded, contracts for delivery 3 months hence, the prices fluctuating as news arrives about harvests in the East Indies and competing shipments from English traders. Insurance underwriters stand ready to quote premiums for ships preparing to sail. Money changers offer to exchange various currencies at posted rates. The entire apparatus of trade and finance is operating, the physical manifestation of the financial innovations that the spice trade had helped create. The institutions and instruments developed for the spice trade outlasted the trade's economic importance. As spices became ordinary commodities with thin profit margins, as the capital requirements for spice trading diminished relative to other forms of commerce and industry, the financial mechanisms that had been created for spices found application elsewhere. Joint stock companies financed railroads and factories. Insurance covered all manner of risks, forward contracts and options, spread to other commodities, and eventually to financial assets themselves. Bills of exchange evolved into modern letters of credit and international payment systems. Accounting methods refined for tracking spice shipments were adapted to manufacturing and retail operations. The intellectual capital, the accumulated knowledge about managing risk and capital across time and space, persisted through the merchants and financiers who had learned their craft in the spice trade. These skills were transferable, applicable to other ventures, and they were passed down through families and apprenticeships, through the informal education that occurred in counting houses and coffee houses and exchanges. The financial sophistication that European commercial centres developed partly through experience with the spice trade gave them advantages when new opportunities arose, when new industries needed capital and organisation, when new risks needed to be assessed and managed. The spice trade had required finance to function, the long distances and time delays and risks demanding sophisticated mechanisms for pooling capital, transferring risk, managing uncertainty, and coordinating activities across vast spaces. In meeting these needs, merchants and financiers created tools and institutions that proved useful far beyond their original purpose, that became part of the permanent infrastructure of commercial capitalism, that persist in recognizable form to the present day. The bills of exchange have evolved into electronic funds transfers, the coffee house trading has moved to computer screens, the accounting has become more sophisticated and standardized. But the underlying principles remain: the patient work of managing capital and risk across time and space, the essential financial machinery that makes complex commerce possible. The spice trade, in this sense, was a forcing function, a demanding application that drove innovation because the stakes were high, and the challenges were genuine, and the solutions that emerged proved valuable enough to be preserved and refined and applied more broadly, as commerce itself evolved and expanded in directions that the spice traders of the 17th century could not have imagined. The financial instruments and institutions that facilitated the spice trade, the joint stock companies and insurance markets and bills of exchange we have just explored, these were the visible mechanisms that historians document in ledgers and archives. But beneath this formal apparatus lay another layer of commerce, networks of people and relationships that made the actual movement of spices possible, but left fewer traces in the historical record. The European merchants whose names appear in company documents and ship manifests were never alone in the trade, never the sole actors making commerce happen. They depended entirely on networks of local traders, interpreters, brokers, and producers whose knowledge and labour were essential, but whose names have largely been forgotten. The spice trade before European arrival had existed for millennia, connecting the islands where spices grew with markets across Asia through indigenous trading networks. Arab merchants sailing dhows across the Indian Ocean, Chinese junks working the Southeast Asian coasts, Malay and Javanese traders moving between the Indonesian islands, Indian merchants operating from ports on the Malabar coast and Coromandel coast. All of these groups had been buying and selling spices for centuries before Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope. These networks didn't disappear when Europeans arrived. Instead, they adapted, incorporating European traders as new participants in existing systems, continuing to function alongside and intertwined with the formal European trading companies. The Gujarati merchants of Western India were particularly important intermediaries throughout the spice trade era. Gujarat had long been a commercial centre, its merchants maintaining trading relationships across the Indian Ocean world, operating their own ships, managing complex credit networks, speaking multiple languages, understanding the customs and expectations of different trading partners. When Portuguese and later Dutch and English traders arrived in Indian ports, they discovered that access to spices required working with these established merchants who controlled supply chains extending from interior regions where spices grew to the coastal ports where European ships called. A European factor stationed in Calicut or Goa purchasing pepper for his company relied on Gujarati or other Indian merchants to actually procure the pepper from cultivators in Kerala's interior. The European might never visit the growing regions, might have no direct contact with the people who actually grew the pepper. His role was to negotiate terms with the Indian merchants who aggregated supply, to arrange payment and shipping to ensure the pepper met quality standards. The Indian merchant, meanwhile, maintained his own network of relationships with smaller traders and with cultivators, providing credit for planting and harvesting, arranging transport from growing regions to ports, managing the complex logistics that brought pepper from vine to warehouse. These Indian merchants operated their own sophisticated credit systems, a cultivator needing funds to tide him through until harvest might borrow from a merchant, agreeing to deliver pepper at a specified price when the harvest came. The arrangement was similar to forward contracts in European markets, but embedded in personal relationships and enforced through community social structures rather than formal legal systems. The merchant who provided credit bore risk that the harvest might fail or that the cultivator might default. But he also gained assurance of supply and the profit from the spread between the price he paid cultivators and the price he charged European buyers. The Chinese trading networks were equally important in Southeast Asia. Chinese merchants, operating from bases in southern China and scattered ports throughout the region, traded extensively in spices and other Southeast Asian products. They brought goods that local populations wanted, Chinese porcelain and silk, copper and iron tools, and exchanged these for pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and other local products. The Chinese junks, large vessels capable of carrying substantial cargoes, were sophisticated ships built and navigated according to accumulated knowledge going back centuries. The Chinese merchants were formidable competitors and sometimes partners to European traders, their knowledge of local languages and customs and their established relationships often giving them advantages. Picture a port in Java in 1650, a small natural harbour where local boats come and go, bringing goods from the interior and taking back items purchased from visiting merchants. A Chinese junk lies at anchor, its cargo holds being loaded with pepper purchased from local traders. Nearby, a VOC ship also takes on cargo, the Dutch factor having negotiated with the same local traders for his own supplies. The local traders are playing the two buyers against each other, not overtly, but through careful management of information and timing, seeking the best price they can obtain. The Chinese captain and the Dutch factor are aware of each other's presence, but may not directly communicate, each working through his own network of local intermediaries. The Malay and Javanese traders who moved between the Indonesian islands were essential connectors in the spice trade network. These were people who knew the seas intimately, who understood the monsoon patterns and the locations of reefs and safe anchorages, who spoke the languages of different island groups and could negotiate across cultural boundaries. They operated smaller vessels that could navigate shallow waters and reach islands that larger European or Chinese ships couldn't access directly. Their local knowledge was invaluable, and European companies employed them as pilots and guides, paying for knowledge that couldn't be found in any chart or sailing manual. Women played significant roles in local spice trade networks, though their participation is less documented than that of male merchants. In many Southeast Asian societies, women were active in local markets, managing retail trade, handling small-scale credit, mediating between different commercial networks. A European merchant purchasing supplies in a port town might negotiate with a woman trader who controlled access to particular goods or who had relationships with producers in the interior. These women understood market dynamics, managed complex social and economic relationships, and exercised agency in contexts that European observers often fail to recognize or document. The interpreters who enabled communication between European merchants and local traders were another invisible but essential group. The language barriers were substantial. A Dutch factor in Banda spoke Dutch, perhaps some Portuguese, which was used as a trade language in many Asian ports, but was unlikely to speak Bandanese or other local languages. Local traders might speak Malay, which served as a lingua franca in much of Southeast Asia, but not European languages. The interpreters bridged these gaps, translating not just words but cultural concepts, explaining European expectations to local merchants and local customs to Europeans, earning their livelihood from their linguistic skills and cultural knowledge. The role of interpreter was delicate and sometimes dangerous. Misunderstandings in commercial negotiations could lead to conflict, and interpreters might be blamed when deals went wrong. But successful interpreters became valuable, building careers and sometimes accumulating wealth through their essential services. Some interpreters operated as cultural brokers in broader senses, advising European factors about local politics and customs, warning about potential problems, facilitating relationships that went beyond simple commercial transactions. Their knowledge was specific and personal, accumulated through experience rather than learned from books, making them impossible to replace easily when they died or moved to other opportunities. The local rulers in spice-producing regions exercised significant control over trade despite European military presence. A sultan or raja might grant trading privileges to European companies, specify what could be purchased and at what terms, collect taxes and duties on trade passing through his territory. These rulers were sophisticated political actors, playing European companies against each other when possible, maintaining their own authority and revenue streams even as European power in the region grew. Their cooperation was necessary for trade to function smoothly, and they extracted value from that necessity through the terms they could negotiate. The credit networks in Asian commercial systems operated according to principles familiar in their basic logic, but different in their details from European credit systems. A merchant extending credit to a cultivator or to another merchant created a relationship with reciprocal obligations that might extend beyond the immediate transaction. The borrower who repaid reliably gained access to future credit on better terms. The lender who provided fair terms and didn't exploit temporarily distressed borrowers built reputation and loyalty that had value beyond the interest earned on specific loans. These reputational mechanisms enforced credit agreements in environments where formal legal enforcement was unavailable or unreliable. The Baniya caste of merchants in India, particularly in Gujarat and other western regions, operated sophisticated financial networks that included credit provision, money changing, and commercial banking functions. A European merchant arriving in an Indian port with a bill of exchange drawn on a correspondent in another port might find that a Baniya money changer would accept the bill, provide immediate payment in local currency, and arrange for the bill to be presented for collection through the Baniya network's own correspondence. This service facilitated European trade while generating fee income for the Baniya merchants who provided it, creating interdependence between European and Indian commercial networks. The weights and measures used in Asian spice trade were diverse and localized, creating opportunities for confusion and arbitrage. A pound of pepper in London weighed a specific amount according to English standards, but pepper in Calicut was measured by local weight units that didn't correspond precisely to English measures. Converting between systems required knowledge and calculation, and merchants who understood these conversions well could benefit from the complexity. The VOC and other European companies attempted to standardize measurements in their trading operations, but local systems persisted, and the interface between European and Asian measurement systems remained a source of transaction costs and occasional disputes. The quality assessment of spices required expertise that was localized and experience-based. Different grades of pepper, distinguished by size, color, and pungency, commanded different prices. Nutmeg could be adulterated or damaged in ways that reduced value, and detecting such problems required handling the product, knowing what to look for. Local merchants who had spent lifetimes working with spices developed intuitive assessments that they could perform quickly, sorting a batch of pepper by quality with an experienced eye and hand. European factors had to develop this expertise or rely on local experts whose assessments they trusted, another form of dependence on local knowledge. Picture a marketplace in Calicut in 1700. The morning sun already warm, the air filled with scents of spices and other goods. Merchants sit with their products spread before them, pepper in various grades, each heap representing different quality and price. A European factor walks through with his local broker, a Gujarati merchant who has worked with the factor's predecessors and knows both the local market and European requirements. They stop at various stalls, the broker examining pepper samples, discussing with sellers in Malayalam which the factor doesn't speak, negotiating prices, occasionally asking the factor's opinion on quality, though the factor's assessment is less expert than the broker's. Transactions are agreed, handshakes exchanged, the broker keeping mental account of quantities and prices to be formalized later in the factor's office. The transportation of spices from growing regions to ports involved networks of porters, boatmen, and cart drivers whose labor was essential but poorly compensated. Pepper harvested in the hills of Kerala needed to be carried to navigable waterways, then moved by boat to coastal ports. Each stage of transport added cost and employed people whose names appear in no records, but whose work was necessary for the spice trade to function. These workers operated in local economies where cash might be scarce, where payment sometimes took the form of goods rather than money, where relationships with employers might be long-standing and involve reciprocal obligations beyond simple wage labour. The resilience of indigenous trading networks in the face of European attempts to monopolise spice trade is worth noting. Even during periods of most intense VOC monopoly enforcement in the Moluccas and Banda Islands, some spices continue to move through channels the VOC didn't control. Local traders, operating smaller vessels and using their knowledge of numerous small harbours and alternative routes, could evade VOC patrols and sell spices to Chinese or English merchants or to indigenous consumers in other parts of the archipelago. This trade, while never matching the volume of VOC-controlled commerce, persisted as a form of resistance to monopoly and as a demonstration that complete control was impossible across such vast distances and complex geographies. The country trade, the term used for Asian to Asian commerce distinct from the Europe to Asia trade, remained substantial throughout the spice trade era. Indian textiles sold in Southeast Asia, Chinese goods distributed throughout the region, Southeast Asian products moving to India, all of this intra-Asian trade dwarfed the European trade in many periods and connected to the spice trade in complex ways. A Gujarati merchant might purchase pepper in Indonesia, sell some to VOC factors for shipment to Europe, and sell the rest in Indian markets for local consumption. The same pepper crop might supply both European and Asian markets through multiple channels, the European trade being only part of a larger commercial web. The religious institutions in Asia, Hindu temples in India, Buddhist monasteries in Southeast Asia, Islamic establishments in various regions sometimes functioned as proto-banks, accepting deposits, providing loans, facilitating trust in commercial transactions. A merchant travelling far from home might deposit funds with a religious institution in one city and receive documentation allowing him to withdraw equivalent value from an affiliated institution in another city, avoiding the risk of carrying cash. These religious commercial functions operated parallel to secular credit networks, providing alternatives that merchants could use according to their preferences and relationships. The market information networks that allowed Asian merchants to make decisions about when and where to buy and sell were sophisticated and fast by the standards of the era. Information about crop conditions, prices in various markets, shipping schedules, political developments, all of this circulated through merchant networks via letters, oral reports from travellers, and the informal communication that occurred when merchants gathered in ports and markets. A Gujarati merchant in Calicut might receive information about pepper prices in Malacca or nutmeg supplies in Banda before VOC factors in the region learned the same information, giving him advantage in negotiations and timing of transactions. The trust networks that enabled long-distance trade in the absence of reliable formal legal enforcement were based on ethnic, religious and family connections. A Tamil merchant in southern India could send goods to a relative or fellow Tamil merchant in Malacca with reasonable confidence that the goods would be sold and proceeds remitted. The shared identity and the reputational mechanisms within the Tamil merchant community providing enforcement. Similarly, Chinese merchants operated networks based on dialect groups and clan associations. Gujarati merchants relied on caste and religious networks. European merchants tried to plug into these existing trust networks, seeking local partners whose reputations and connections could facilitate their trade. Picture a Gujarati merchant's house in Surat in 1680. The merchant meeting with his son and nephew to discuss the family's trading ventures. They review information received from correspondents in various ports, discuss which markets seem favourable, decide how to deploy the capital they have available. The conversation involves detailed knowledge of multiple markets, assessment of risks and opportunities, calculations about timing and quantities. The merchant's knowledge has been accumulated over decades, his network of relationships built through generations of family trading. He operates with sophistication that equals or exceeds that of any European trading company, but his activities leave fewer documentary traces because his records are private and his letters are mostly lost to history. The women in these merchant families often managed household accounts and participated in decision-making, though their roles might not be visible to outsiders. In many Asian commercial cultures, women could own property, engage in trade, and exercise economic agency in ways that were constrained in contemporary European societies. A merchant widow might continue operating her late husband's trading business, maintaining relationships with his correspondents, making decisions about purchases and sales. The historical invisibility of these women reflects the biases of sources more than the reality of their participation in commercial life. The servants and subordinates in merchant households, the clerks who maintained accounts, the guards who protected warehouses, the messengers who carried correspondence, all of these people were part of the infrastructure that made trade possible. Their compensation was modest, their lives difficult, but their labour was necessary. A merchant's success depended on having reliable subordinates, and the relationships between merchants and their staffs were complex, involving elements of patron-client relationships alongside simple employment. Loyal servants might be rewarded with opportunities to trade on their own account on a small scale, accumulating capital that could allow them eventually to become independent merchants. The resilience and adaptability of these indigenous trading networks, their persistence through centuries of political change and European intervention, their ability to evolve and incorporate new participants while maintaining core functions, all of this demonstrates that the spice trade was never solely a European achievement or creation. It was always a collaborative enterprise, whether that collaboration was willing or coerced, equal or exploitative, visible or hidden. The European role, while significant and increasingly dominant in certain periods and regions, was embedded in and dependent on networks that pre-existed European arrival and that would persist after European dominance faded. The spice trade was global not just in its geographic extent, but in its genuinely multicultural character, requiring cooperation and exchange among people of vastly different languages, religions, customs, and interests, all of them working within and around the structures that existed to pursue their own goals and survival in a complex and often difficult commercial world that connected them across distances they might never personally traverse. The networks of indigenous traders and intermediaries that we have just explored persisted through the 19th century and beyond, adapting to new political and economic conditions even as the spice trade itself completed its transformation from luxury commerce to mundane commodity business. By 1800, the economic structure that had sustained extraordinary spice prices for millennia was collapsing completely. The combination of expanded cultivation, intensified competition, improved transportation, and changing European tastes would reduce spices to everyday grocery items, their prices falling to levels that would have seemed impossible to merchants a century earlier. The 19th century brought technological changes that accelerated the price decline. Steamships, which began replacing sailing vessels for long-distance cargo in the mid-1800s, reduced voyage times and increased reliability. A steamship could make the journey from Southeast Asia to Europe in roughly half the time a sailing vessel required, and it could maintain schedule regardless of wind patterns, allowing more predictable and frequent service. The reduction in transit time meant capital was tied up for shorter periods, reducing the time-related costs that had always been significant in long-distance trade. The increased frequency of service meant less need to hold large inventories in European warehouses, further reducing capital requirements and storage costs. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 shortened the voyage from Asia to Europe even more dramatically. Ships no longer needed to sail around Africa. The canal route through the Mediterranean reduced the distance by thousands of miles. The time saving translated directly into cost reduction, making Asian products including spices cheaper to transport. The canal itself was a massive infrastructure investment, requiring years of construction and enormous capital, but once built, it served all shipping, distributing its benefits broadly. The spice trade benefited along with trade in other goods, the costs of moving pepper from Indonesia to London falling as the route shortened and transit time decreased. The development of refrigeration and canning technologies reduced the importance of spices for food preservation, one of their traditional functions. Fresh meat could be preserved through cold storage, eliminating much of the need for heavy salting and the associated need for spices to mask the flavour. Canned foods, which became increasingly common in the late 1800s, provided another alternative to traditional preservation methods. As these technologies spread and became more affordable, the preservation value of spices declined, leaving flavour as their primary function. This shift didn't eliminate demand for spices, but it did change the nature of that demand, making it more about taste preference than practical necessity. The medical beliefs that had sustained part of spice demand throughout earlier centuries largely disappeared as modern medicine developed. By the late 1800s, European physicians no longer prescribed pepper for digestive complaints or nutmeg as plague preventative. The germ theory of disease, the development of effective pharmaceuticals, the general advance of medical knowledge, all of this meant that spices were recognized as flavorings rather than medicines. The loss of medicinal demand didn't dramatically affect prices because cultivation had expanded so much that supply far exceeded what even medicinal and culinary demand together had previously supported. But it represented another way in which spices were becoming ordinary, losing the special status they had held for so long. The prices themselves by the late 1800s and early 1900s had fallen to levels that made spices accessible to essentially everyone in industrialized countries. A pound of pepper in London in 1900 might cost 3 or 4 pence, representing perhaps an hour's wage for an unskilled labourer. Compare this to the 2 shillings per pound in 1300, which had represented 4 to 6 days of wages. The real price, adjusted for general wage levels and inflation, had fallen by a factor of perhaps 30 or 40 over 6 centuries, one of the most dramatic and sustained price declines in the history of any commodity. Nutmeg and cloves, which had maintained premium pricing longer than pepper due to their more limited cultivation and Dutch monopoly enforcement, also fell to ordinary commodity status by the early 1900s. A quantity of nutmeg that might have cost several shillings in 1700 might cost only pennies by 1900. The spices were available in every grocery shop, sold in small tins or paper packets, used casually without thought for their cost. The transformation from luxury to commodity was complete. The entire elaborate structure of monopoly enforcement and risk management and long-distance commerce reduced to the mundane logistics of moving low-margin products through modern distribution systems. The cultivation of spices had spread globally by the 1900s. Pepper grew not just in India and Indonesia but in Malaysia, Ceylon, various African countries, even in some parts of South America. Nutmeg and cloves, once confined to a few small Indonesian islands, now grew in Zanzibar, Grenada, Madagascar, and other tropical regions with suitable climates. The geographic monopolies that had been the foundation of extraordinary prices no longer existed. Any country with appropriate climate and some agricultural expertise could grow these spices, and many did, the expansion of supply continuing until prices fell to levels that barely covered production costs in higher-cost regions. The trading companies that had dominated the spice trade declined in importance or transformed into different kinds of businesses. The Vosi had already dissolved in 1799, its monopoly position eroded and its debts overwhelming. The English East India Company lost its trading functions gradually through the 1800s, eventually becoming purely an administrative entity for governing British India, before being dissolved completely after the Indian Rebellion of 1857. The spice trade that had justified these companies' formation had become too competitive and low margin to support the elaborate corporate structures and monopoly privileges they'd been granted. New companies emerged to handle the commodity spice trade, but they were different in character from the old monopolistic trading companies. These were import-export firms, food processors, grocery wholesalers, businesses operating in competitive markets with thin margins, making profits through volume and efficiency rather than through monopoly control and extraordinary markups. The skills required were different, less about negotiating monopoly agreements with distant rulers, more about managing supply chains and distribution networks, about branding and packaging and retail marketing. Picture a grocery shop in London in 1920, a small establishment in a working-class neighbourhood. The shelves hold various goods, including a section for spices. Tins of pepper, boxes of nutmeg, small packets of cloves, all clearly labelled with prices, available for immediate purchase by anyone who walks in. A housewife, planning the week's meals on a limited budget, picks up a tin of pepper without hesitation, the cost being only a few pence, negligible in her household accounts. She adds it to her basket along with other purchases, ordinary shopping requiring no special planning or consideration. The pepper she's buying travelled from Indonesia, moved through a supply chain involving cultivators, exporters, shippers, importers, wholesalers and retailers. But all of this complexity is invisible to her. The price low enough that she doesn't need to think about the commodity's history or the system that delivers it. The cultural persistence of spice-related language and concepts provides interesting traces of the era when these substances were precious. English retains phrases like spicing things up to mean adding interest or excitement, reflecting the time when spices were exciting additions to food. The Spice Islands remains a romantic name even though the islands themselves are now part of Indonesia and produce spices that are mundane commodities. Brand names like Old Spice evoke nostalgia for an era of adventure and exotic trade, though the products they sell have no connection to the historical spice trade. These linguistic and cultural remnants are like archaeological fragments, surviving traces of attitudes and meanings from a time when spices carried weight they no longer possess. The place names also persist. The Maluku Islands, the historic Moluccas, are still there, still growing cloves, though Indonesia now produces cloves across many islands, and other countries also produce substantial quantities. The Banda Islands still exist, their population having recovered slowly from the VUC's violent conquest. The nutmeg trees still producing, though Banda nutmeg is now just one source among many. Kerala in India still grows pepper, the Malabar coast still exports spices, but these exports now compete with production from Vietnam, which has become the world's largest pepper producer, and from dozens of other countries. The modern spice trade is substantial in volume, but modest in value relative to global commerce. Millions of tons of spices move around the world annually, but the total value is measured in billions of dollars, a tiny fraction of global trade. The companies that dominate the trade are food processing and distribution companies, firms like McCormick in the United States, which process, package and distribute spices alongside other food products. These companies compete on quality, branding and distribution efficiency, not on monopoly control of supply. The profit margins are thin. Survival depends on volume and operational efficiency. The commodity exchanges where spices are traded alongside other agricultural products operate according to modern financial market principles. Pepper futures contracts trade on exchanges in India and other countries, allowing producers and consumers to hedge price risk, speculators to bet on price movements. But the price movements themselves are modest. Pepper prices fluctuate perhaps 10 or 20% year to year based on weather conditions affecting harvests and shifts in supply and demand, nothing like the dramatic swings that characterized earlier centuries when supply was more constrained and demand less elastic. The fair trade movement and organic certification in recent decades have created premium market segments where spices command higher prices than conventional commodity grades. A consumer concerned about environmental sustainability or labour conditions might pay several times the standard price for organic or fair trade certified pepper. These premiums echo in a very different context. The earlier differentiation between high-quality and low-quality spices, the willingness of some consumers to pay more for products meeting certain standards. But even these premium prices are modest by historical standards, perhaps 50 or 75 cents per ounce, where medieval prices, adjusted for inflation, would be $10 or $20 per ounce or more. The cultivators in spice-producing regions today face economic conditions that have both improved and worsened compared to their ancestors in earlier centuries. They're no longer subject to forced cultivation agreements or monopsony power of monopolistic trading companies. They can sell to multiple buyers, can choose what crops to grow based on market signals, have access to information about prices in various markets. These are improvements, representing greater economic freedom and agency, but the prices they receive are very low, the margins in commodity agriculture being thin, and many spice farmers live in poverty despite producing goods that are consumed globally. The economics of commodity production create pressure toward larger-scale operations and efficiency improvements that may not benefit small cultivators. A large plantation with modern cultivation techniques, efficient processing equipment, and direct access to export markets can produce spices at lower cost per unit than a small farmer using traditional methods. The competitive pressure drives consolidation, though small-scale production persists because spices like pepper can be successfully grown on small plots interspersed with other crops, allowing small farmers to participate in the market even if they can't compete on pure cost efficiency. Picture a pepper farm in Vietnam in 2020, a small plot owned by a family that has been growing pepper for several generations. The vines are trained on concrete posts rather than living trees, a modern technique that increases yield. The harvest is processed using small machines rather than all by hand, another efficiency improvement. The farmer sells his pepper to a cooperative that aggregates production from multiple small farmers, giving them better bargaining power with exporters than they would have individually. The price he receives per kilogram is modest, enough to provide a living if the harvest is good, not enough to become prosperous. He supplements his income with other crops and occasional wage work. His children are considering whether to continue farming or seek work in cities where wages might be higher and more reliable. The environmental and social costs of commodity spice production receive more attention now than in earlier centuries, though whether this attention translates into meaningful change remains uncertain. The expansion of cultivation into forested areas, the use of pesticides and fertilizers, the pressure to maximize yields even at environmental cost, these are concerns in modern spice-producing regions. Some organizations and consumers push for more sustainable practices, but the economic pressure toward low-cost production works against environmental protection when the two goals conflict. the fundamental tension between commodity economics and sustainability remains unresolved. The question of what lessons the history of the spice trade offers is worth considering as our journey through these centuries approaches its end. One lesson might be about the instability of monopoly, the way that extraordinary profits attract competition that eventually erodes monopoly power regardless of how ruthlessly monopoly is enforced. The Dutch destroyed nutmeg trees and populations, maintained military forces across thousands of miles, invested enormous resources in monopoly preservation, and yet the monopoly eventually collapsed as spice cultivation spread beyond their control. Economic forces proved stronger than military power, though the process took centuries. Another lesson might be about the relationship between supply constraints and value. Spices were precious because they were scarce, because they grew only in specific places and were desired in distant locations. As the constraints on supply eroded through expanded cultivation and improved transportation, as the distances effectively shrank through faster ships and better infrastructure, the value declined toward the actual cost of production and distribution. The lesson applies beyond spices to any commodity or asset whose high value depends on artificial or natural scarcity that might prove temporary. A third lesson might be about the unequal distribution of gains from trade. The spice trade generated enormous wealth, but that wealth flowed primarily to merchants, investors, and trading companies in Europe. The cultivators who grew the spices received small fractions of the final value. The intermediaries extracted their portions, the transporters earned their fees, but the people whose labour produced the actual spices saw minimal benefit from the high prices paid by European consumers. This pattern of unequal distribution is not unique to spices but characterises much international trade, historical and contemporary, raising questions about fairness and about the sustainability of arrangements where producers receive minimal compensation for their work. A fourth lesson might be about the role of information and knowledge. The extraordinary profits in the spice trade were partly built on information asymmetry, European consumers not knowing what spices cost in Asia, Asian producers not knowing what Europeans paid, intermediaries keeping information fragmented to maintain their positions. As information spread, as prices became more transparent, as more participants understood the full chain of value, the profit opportunities that depended on opacity disappeared. The lesson suggests the importance of information transparency for market efficiency and for fairness, though achieving such transparency remains challenging in complex global supply chains. The Belt and Road Initiative announced by China in 2013 invites comparison with historical trade routes, including those that carried spices. China's program to build infrastructure connecting Asia with Europe and Africa to establish new trade routes and reduce transportation costs echoes the Venetian galleys and Portuguese carracks and Dutch East India men that once carried spices along similar paths. The specifics are different. The goods traded are different. The technology is vastly more advanced, but the fundamental goal of connecting distant regions through commerce and infrastructure investment has continuity with the patterns established centuries ago when the pursuit of pepper and nutmeg first drove Europeans to find maritime routes to Asia. The transformation of spices from luxury to commodity is now so complete that most people who use them daily have no awareness of their history. The black pepper in a grinder, the nutmeg in a spice rack, these are just ingredients. purchased without thought at any grocery store for prices so low that they barely register in household budgets. The centuries of commerce and conflict that brought these spices from remote islands to kitchen shelves, the financial innovations they spurred, the lives spent and fortunes made and lost, all of this history is invisible to contemporary users, compressed into products so ordinary that they require no explanation, no special knowledge, no particular attention beyond their flavour contribution to the meal being prepared. Picture that peppercorn again, the one we imagined at the beginning of this long journey, held in your palm, its weight negligible, its cost nearly zero. That single seed contains within it the entire history we have traced, the Roman gold flowing eastward, the Venetian merchants calculating their profits, the Portuguese ships rounding Africa, the Dutch violence in the Spice Islands, the financial innovations in Amsterdam's coffee houses, the indigenous traders who made commerce possible, the long, slow transformation from precious to commonplace. But none of that history is visible in the object itself, and none of it is necessary to know in order to use the pepper for its current purpose, which is simply to add a bit of sharp flavour to food. The spice trade as a distinct chapter in economic history is over, concluded, past. Spices are no longer worth more than gold, no longer worth fighting wars over, no longer capable of generating the extraordinary profits that once made merchants wealthy and financed empires. They have become what they perhaps should always have been: ordinary agricultural products valued for their flavours, traded in competitive markets, accessible to anyone who wants them. The transformation took centuries, cost thousands of lives, generated and destroyed fortunes, reshaped financial institutions and global trade patterns. And the result is that you can walk into a shop and purchase these once precious substances for pennies, scatter them across your food without a thought, the entire elaborate history reduced to the simple, present reality of flavour and convenience and the complete ordinariness of goods that travelled so far and meant so much and now mean, economically speaking, almost nothing at all. And so we return to that peppercorn, resting somewhere in your kitchen perhaps, or held in memory, its weight so slight you might not notice it at all. We have followed its journey across centuries and oceans, watched as something precious became ordinary through the patient work of cultivation and commerce, and human desire meeting human ingenuity. The merchants who calculated risks in candlelit counting houses, the sailors who endured months at sea, the cultivators who tended vines in tropical heat, all of them are gone now, their labours complete, their stories told. What remains is the pepper itself, still growing, still travelling, still adding its small warmth to meals, its history invisible, but somehow present in each grain. There's nothing you need to remember from this long wandering through spice routes and market prices, through monopolies and their collapse, through the slow transformation of value. The dates can dissolve, the names fade, the economic principles drift away like morning mist. These were just stories after all, patterns in time, humans organising their desires and their commerce, creating elaborate structures that seemed permanent but proved temporary, as all things prove temporary given enough patience and time. You are part of this continuing story, connected by invisible threads to every person who has ever calculated a price, or taken a risk, or wondered about the worth of small things. But tonight, there is no need to hold that connection consciously, no need to trace the lineages or understand the patterns. Tonight there is only the gentle letting go of information, the release of attention, the soft settling into rest. Let the merchants fade into the shadows of their counting houses. Let the ships dissolve back into the water that carried them. Let the spices themselves become just scent and memory, less substantial than breath, lighter than thought. There is nothing here that requires keeping, nothing that needs your consciousness to preserve it. The story was told, the journey completed, and now there is only the quiet permission to release it all, to let it drift away into the peaceful dark where nothing needs remembering and nothing needs attention. The peppercorn falls from your hand, or perhaps you never held it at all. The weight, already slight, becomes nothing. The journey ends where it began, in stillness, in the gentle recognition that even precious things become ordinary, that all commerce concludes, that every story eventually grows quiet, and in that quiet there is only rest, only the soft dissolving of awareness, only sleep. Rest now, let go now, only sleep remains.